Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'd been planning this trip for months, obsessing over every detail like my life depended on it. A full week alone on the Little Tennessee River, starting in Franklin and winding through the rugged corners of the Nantahala National Forest until I hit Fontana Lake. October had always been my favorite time. The air sharp enough to cut glass, trees bleeding crimson and gold, and fewer people cluttering the banks with their noise and laughter. Solo paddling wasn't new to me. I'd tackled stretches of river across Appalachia for 15 years, each trip adding another layer to my understanding of the water's moods. But this run felt different somehow, special in a way that made my skin crawl with anticipation. It was remote enough to feel genuinely wild, yet familiar enough from my research to seem manageable. The first 2 days unfolded like a perfect dream. I paddled steadily through calm waters, the rhythm of my strokes becoming meditative. Black bears watched me from distant banks, their dark eyes tracking my movement with lazy curiosity. Rainbow trout flickered beneath my kayak like living jewels, their colors impossibly bright in the clear mountain water. I photographed everything, documenting each bend and rapid for my journal. On the third morning, a thick mist settled over the river like a burial shroud, wrapping the ancient trees in gauzy curtains that muffled sound and distorted distance. My GPS flickered erratically, the screen scrambling between coordinates before stabilizing briefly, then dying altogether. I cursed modern technology and pulled out my backup, dog-eared topographic maps stuffed into a waterproof dry bag, pencil marks from previous trips creating a spider web of routes across the paper. Around midday, just past the Needmore Road Bridge, the river forked without warning. One branch, the larger and more inviting, flowed west exactly as my maps predicted, broad and welcoming with gentle rapids that sparkled in the filtered sunlight. The other veered sharply northeast, narrowing to half the width, its waters darker and somehow hungrier looking. My finger traced along the map until I found it. The faintest dashed line accompanied by a handwritten notation in faded blue ink. Deadwater Gap, Abandoned Project 1927. My mind flashed back to the old outfitter in Franklin, a weathered man with gray whiskers and hollow, knowing eyes. He'd chuckled when I mentioned my planned route, but his laughter held no warmth. "Stay clear of Deadwater Gap, son," he'd said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. State tried to build a dam up there in the 20s, never finished it, left behind nothing but rusted metal, flooded tunnels, and stories that'll turn your hair white. Standing there at the fork, curiosity gnawed at me like hunger. A short detour wouldn't hurt, I reasoned. If trouble showed its face, I'd turn back immediately. Besides, it would make excellent material for my kayaking blog. Adventure writers needed stories worth telling, and safe routes rarely provided those. I steered into the narrower passage, immediately feeling the temperature drop as canyon walls rose around me like the ribs of some massive, long-dead beast. The change was dramatic, from open river to enclosed gorge in less than 100 yards. Rhododendron bushes pressed close to the water's edge, their dark leaves creating a living tunnel that blocked most of the sky. Within 30 minutes, the gorge tightened its grip, transforming the cheerful babble of flowing water into something more ominous. Sunlight became a rare commodity, filtered through dense branches until it resembled the weak glow of a dying flashlight. My paddle strokes echoed strangely here, bouncing off damp stone and fallen timber with metallic resonance that made me wince. The current picked up gradually, pulling me forward with increasing insistence. What had started as gentle coaxing now felt like invisible hands dragging me deeper into the gorge's throat. I tried to activate my GPS one more time, pressing buttons frantically as the screen remained stubbornly black. The device was completely dead, as if the gorge itself had drained its electronic life. A half-mile further downstream, I encountered the first concrete evidence of human ambition gone wrong. A massive slab of crumbling concrete jutted from the muddy bank like a broken tooth, moss covering most of its surface in fuzzy green patches. Rusted rebar poked through the structure at odd angles, creating a skeletal framework that spoke of collapse and abandonment. It was clearly some kind of control house or turbine housing, left to decay when the project died. Weeds grew through cracks in the foundation, and something that might have been poison ivy climbed the walls in thick, sinister ropes. The sight disturbed me more than it should have. It looked fundamentally wrong among the forest's ancient rhythm, like a scar that had never properly healed. I paddled past quickly, not wanting to linger near the decaying monument to human failure, but more structures appeared around each bend. Remnants of access roads, collapsed bridges, rusted machinery half buried in silt. Each one sent a fresh wave of unease through my chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with physical exertion. As afternoon shadows lengthened into something approaching evening, I found a narrow gravel bar barely wide enough for my tent. The space felt cramped, claustrophobic, pressed between the dark water and dense woods that seemed to lean inward with predatory interest. I dragged my kayak onto the stones, its hull scraping against sharp rocks with sounds like fingernails on slate. Pitching camp felt urgent somehow, each tent stake driven into the ground with more force than necessary. Usually I loved the ritual of making camp, the methodical transformation of wilderness into temporary home. But here, surrounded by the gorge's oppressive walls, every action felt watched. I found myself glancing frequently into the tree line, convinced I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. As darkness claimed the gorge completely, the silence became absolute and unnatural. The normal symphony of night sounds, crickets chirping, owls calling, small creatures rustling through underbrush, was completely absent. Even the river seemed to muffle its voice, flowing past my camp with secretive whispers rather than honest babbling. I cooked dinner by headlamp, the beam creating a small circle of normalcy in the pressing darkness. My hands shook slightly as I stirred the freeze-dried pasta, though I told myself it was just the cold mountain air. The food tasted like cardboard, but I forced myself to eat, knowing I'd need energy for whatever tomorrow might bring. Crawling into my sleeping bag felt like burrowing into a cocoon of false security. The tent walls, thin nylon barrier between me and whatever lurked in the gorge's depths, seemed pathetically inadequate. I lay still, listening to my own breathing, and the tent fabric's soft rustling in the night breeze. I must have dozed fitfully, because I woke with a start to find my watch reading 2:17 a.m. My heart was already racing before my conscious mind identified the source of alarm, a rhythmic, steady splashing echoing from upstream. Not the random sounds of animals drinking or crossing, but the unmistakable cadence of human paddling. Dip, lift, each stroke deliberate and measured. "Hello!" I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking with sudden fear. "Is someone there?" The splashing stopped immediately, as if switched off. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I waited, counting my rapid heartbeats, straining to hear any response. None came. Minutes stretched into a small eternity. I tried to convince myself it had been imagination, fatigue and nerves creating phantom sounds from the river's natural music. But I knew better. Those paddle strokes had been real, purposeful, getting steadily closer until my shout had stopped them. The worst part was the silence that followed. Not the gradual return of normal night sounds, but absolute quiet, as if whatever had been approaching was now holding perfectly still, listening just as intently as I was. Waiting. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling fingers, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the water. The light revealed nothing but dark river surface and the looming shapes of boulders. But somehow that made things worse. The darkness beyond my light's reach seemed to pulse with hidden presence. Hour after hour passed without sleep returning. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, every muscle tensed, listening for the slightest sound. Occasionally I thought I heard something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling without wind, the soft scrape of something moving across stone. But when I focused on these sounds, they faded into uncertainty. Dawn seemed impossibly far away, time moving with the sluggish pace of honey in winter. My watch became an enemy, its glowing digits crawling forward with maddening slowness. 2:43 a.m., 3:12 a.m., 3:38 a.m. Each check revealed how little progress the night had made toward morning's safety. By 4 a.m., exhaustion began battling with fear for control of my consciousness. My eyelids felt weighted with lead, but every time I started to drift off, some small sound or imagined movement would snap me back to wakefulness. The tense nylon walls seemed to breathe around me, expanding and contracting with each gust of wind. When the first gray hints of dawn finally began filtering through the gorge, I had been awake for over 6 hours straight. My body ached from maintaining tension, and my nerves felt raw as exposed wire. But I had survived the night, and daylight promised escape from whatever had been stalking me in the darkness. The weak morning light revealed a landscape subtly changed from the day before, as if the darkness had rearranged details while I cowered in my tent. Frost covered everything in a thin shell of ice crystals, and my breath formed thick clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. I broke camp with frantic efficiency, stuffing gear into dry bags without my usual methodical care. Everything felt urgent now. Staying in one place too long invited whatever had circled my camp during the night to return. My fingers, stiff with cold and adrenaline, fumbled with buckles and zippers. The river had dropped several inches overnight, exposing muddy banks that bore strange impressions, marks that might have been footprints if they hadn't been so oddly shaped. Too narrow for adult human feet, but too large and well-defined for animals. I forced myself not to look too closely, afraid of what I might confirm. My kayak felt heavier as I dragged it back to the water, as if the night had somehow added invisible weight. The hull bore new scratches I didn't remember, long parallel gouges in the plastic that caught the morning light like claw marks. I told myself they must have happened during yesterday's rocky passages, though I couldn't recall any impacts severe enough to cause such damage. Paddling downstream, I hoped distance would ease the oppressive atmosphere, but the gorge seemed determined to maintain its grip on my sanity. Around each bend, new evidence of the failed dam project emerged from the morning mist. Concrete intake pipes jutting from the bank like broken bones. Rusted machinery half submerged in murky pools. The skeletal remains of wooden scaffolding, gray with age and decay. Each structure told part of a story I was beginning to wish I'd never started reading. This had been an ambitious project once. Dozens of workers blasting tunnels through solid rock, pouring concrete foundations, installing massive turbines designed to harness the river's power. Then something had gone wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the site had been abandoned so quickly that valuable equipment remained where it fell. The largest structure appeared around a sharp bend, a partially completed dam that created a deep pool above its concrete face. Water spilled over the top in multiple streams, creating a curtain that sparkled deceptively in the pale sunlight. But it was what I saw floating in the pool that made me dig my paddle hard into the water, driving myself toward shore. A small boat drifted near the dam's base, handmade from rough planks and canvas, primitive but functional. A single lamp mounted on what looked like an old mining helmet reflected weakly off the water near the boat's stern. The craft appeared empty, but something about its presence filled me with dread. As I watched, the boat began moving with purpose, not drifting with the current, but being deliberately propelled by someone or something I couldn't see. It slipped behind the falling water, disappearing into the dark space between the dam and the curtain of overflow. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I can see you." The boat reappeared on the far side of the falls, empty as before but still moving with clear intent. Then, without warning, it vanished completely. not around a bend or behind an obstruction, but simply gone as if it had never existed. I sat in my kayak, heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the empty pool. The rational part of my mind supplied explanations, optical illusions created by moving water, debris that had only appeared boat-shaped, fatigue playing tricks with my perception. But my gut knew better. Something was wrong with this place, wrong in ways that went deeper than abandoned construction projects or unusual wildlife. The river below the dam narrowed dramatically, forcing me to navigate between fallen trees and protruding boulders with increasing difficulty. What had been challenging paddling became an obstacle course that required constant attention, every stroke calculated to avoid obstacles that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Debris choked the channel, not natural forest litter, but the detritus of human failure. Splintered lumber from demolished buildings, twisted steel reinforcement rods, concrete chunks that had broken off from larger structures upstream. The river was digesting the failed dam project slowly, redistributing its components throughout the gorge like the scattered bones of some massive corpse. I had to get out and portage frequently, dragging my kayak over blockages that would have been impassable in the water. Each portage was an ordeal, scrambling over slippery rocks while managing 60 pounds of boat and gear, all while fighting the growing certainty that I was being watched from the dense forest on both sides of the gorge. The worst moment came during a particularly difficult portage around a massive log jam. I had pulled my kayak halfway over a fallen oak when movement on the opposite ridge caught my eye. Two small figures stood perfectly motionless among the trees, clearly human in shape, but wrong in proportions. They weren't children exactly, but they weren't adults either. Something in between that made my skin crawl with primal unease. Their posture was what disturbed me most. Perfectly still, arms hanging at their sides, heads cocked at identical angles as if listening to sounds I couldn't hear. They didn't wave or call out, didn't acknowledge my presence in any normal human way. They simply watched with an intensity that felt physically uncomfortable, like being studied by predators calculating the best moment to strike. I blinked, and they were gone. Not departed. Gone. The space where they had stood showed no sign of recent occupancy, no disturbed vegetation or lingering movement. It was as if they had been absorbed back into the forest itself, leaving me to question whether I had seen anything at all. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of exhaustion and growing paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide watchers. Every sound beyond my immediate vicinity might be approaching footsteps. I found myself spinning around constantly, certain I was being followed but never quite catching sight of my pursuers. As darkness approached, I faced a horrible choice. I could continue paddling in the dark, risking injury or death on the obstacle-filled river, or I could camp again and face another night of terror. The memory of those rhythmic paddle strokes and the boat that vanished into nothingness made the decision feel impossible. But exhaustion was making the choice for me. My arms ached from hours of portaging, and hypothermia was becoming a real threat as my wet clothes leached body heat into the cold air. I had to find shelter, even if that shelter felt more like a trap than safety. I spotted a small rocky outcropping about 50 yards up the bank, elevated enough to provide some tactical advantage while still being accessible with my gear. The climb was treacherous in the failing light, loose rocks skittering down the slope with each step. But eventually I reached a flat area just large enough for my tent. Setting up camp felt like preparing for siege. Every tent stake driven into the rocky soil was hammered with the knowledge that the thin nylon walls provided no real protection against whatever had been stalking me. I arranged my gear methodically, keeping my knife and flashlight within easy reach, though I had no illusion that either would be effective against threats I couldn't understand. As full darkness claimed the gorge, I sat outside my tent listening to the oppressive silence. No nightbirds called. No insects buzzed around my headlamp. Even the river seemed to muffle its voice, flowing past my elevated position with whispered secrecy rather than honest noise. That's when I saw the light moving along the opposite bank, a single weak beam sweeping slowly back and forth like a search pattern. It moved too steadily to be carried by someone walking rough terrain, gliding through the trees with impossible smoothness. Occasionally it would pause, the beam holding steady on a particular spot for long seconds before resuming its methodical search. The light disappeared around a bend, but I knew it would be back. Whatever was hunting me had found my location and was probably coordinating some kind of approach. The elevated position that had seemed tactically sound now felt like a trap. There was only one way down, and anything coming up would have to pass directly below my camp. I forced myself to remain still, controlling my breathing and listening for any sound that might indicate approaching danger. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. My legs cramped from maintaining the same position, but I didn't dare move or make any noise that might reveal my exact location. Around 2 a.m. I heard them, soft footsteps on loose rock, multiple sets moving with careful coordination up the slope toward my camp. Not the random scrambling of animals, but the purposeful advancement of something that understood tactics and terrain. Panic shot through me like electric current. I grabbed only my most essential gear, knife, flashlight, emergency blanket, and slipped out the back of my tent into the darkness beyond. The rocky outcropping provided some concealment, but I knew it was only temporary. Whatever was approaching would find my abandoned campsite within minutes. I stumbled blindly uphill through thorny underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and exposed skin. The weak moonlight filtering through the forest canopy provided barely enough illumination to avoid the largest obstacles, but I moved as quickly as I dared, driven by terror and adrenaline. Behind me, I heard sounds that confirmed my worst fears. Tent fabric ripping, gear being scattered and examined, low voices speaking in tones too quiet and distorted to understand. They had found my camp and were conducting a thorough search, learning everything they could about their quarry. I climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, until I crested the ridge and began descending toward the river on the far side. The sound of moving water guided me through the darkness, drawing me toward what I hoped would be an escape route. But instead of the river, I found something much worse. A circular opening carved into the hillside, part of the abandoned dam project's infrastructure. The tunnel mouth yawned like a hungry throat, but behind me the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Soft voices calling to each other in the darkness, coordinating their search pattern with terrifying efficiency. I had no choice. The tunnel might be a dead end, but staying outside guaranteed capture by whatever was hunting me through the forest. I plunged into the artificial cave, my flashlight beam revealing concrete walls slick with moisture and decades of decay. The tunnel was larger than I had expected, wide enough for several people to walk abreast. Rusted rails ran along the floor, probably used to transport equipment during construction. Side passages branched off into deeper darkness, creating a maze of interconnected chambers and access shafts. I chose the largest passage and followed it deeper into the mountain, my footsteps echoing despite my attempts at stealth. The air grew colder and more humid as I descended, carrying the smell of rust, standing water, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I didn't want to identify. After several minutes of stumbling through the darkness, I reached a larger chamber where multiple tunnels converged. Ancient machinery filled the space. Massive turbine housings, electrical panels with their guts exposed, pumps and generators that would never run again. Everything was covered in layers of rust and mineral deposits from decades of water damage. In one corner of the chamber, I found a pile of rotted canvas and moldy blankets, evidence that someone else had sheltered here before me. The fabric fell apart at my touch, revealing scraps of newspaper that crumbled into illegible fragments. But one headline survived long enough for me to read: "Dam project workers still missing, dated September 15, 1927. The implications hit me like physical blows. Workers from the original project had disappeared, never found, never explained. The children I had glimpsed were their descendants, born in these tunnels and raised on stories of abandonment and betrayal. They had never left because they had nowhere else to go, creating their own society in the dark spaces beneath the mountain. A sound from the tunnel entrance froze my blood. The scraping of small feet on concrete, moving with the confidence of those who knew every inch of this underground maze. They had followed me into their domain, and now I was trapped with nowhere left to run. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the rusted bulk of a massive generator, trying to become invisible in the absolute darkness. My breathing sounded thunderous in the confined space, each inhalation and exhalation announcing my location to anyone listening carefully. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices speaking a dialect I couldn't understand. Words that might have been English once but had evolved in isolation until they became something else entirely. Occasionally I caught fragments that sounded familiar, but the meaning remained opaque. A weak light appeared at the tunnel entrance, growing stronger as its bearer approached my hiding place. Not the harsh beam of a modern flashlight, but the warmer glow of flame, probably a candle or oil lamp. The light danced across the chamber walls, creating shifting shadows that transformed rusted machinery into crouching monsters. I held my breath as the light passed close to my hiding spot, the bearer moving with casual familiarity through the obstacle course of abandoned equipment. Whoever was carrying the lamp knew this space intimately, navigating by memory as much as sight. More lights appeared behind the first, at least 3 or 4 separate sources moving in coordinated patterns. They were conducting a methodical search of the chamber, checking behind each piece of machinery with practiced efficiency. It was only a matter of time before they found me. Desperate, I began moving carefully along the wall, using the generator as concealment while working toward one of the side passages I had noticed earlier. The concrete floor was littered with debris that threatened to betray my movement with each step. Broken glass, metal fragments, chunks of deteriorated concrete. A piece of rusted pipe clanged against my shin, the metallic sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. The searching lights immediately converged on my location, and I heard excited voices calling to each other in their strange dialect. I abandoned stealth and ran blindly toward the nearest tunnel, my flashlight beam wildly illuminating the passage ahead. Behind me, the pursuit began in earnest. Multiple sets of feet pounding against concrete, voices raised in what sounded like hunting calls. The passage branched and branched again, creating a maze of potential escape routes and deadly dead ends. I chose directions randomly, hoping speed would compensate for my ignorance of the tunnel system's layout. My pursuers knew every twist and turn, but they were also hindered by their lights and the need to coordinate their movements. Some passages led to chambers filled with standing water that rose to my knees, the liquid black and foul-smelling. Others terminated abruptly in cave-ins or partially collapsed ceilings that forced me to crawl through spaces barely large enough for an adult body. The pursuit continued relentlessly, sometimes close enough that I could hear individual voices, other times fading to distant echoes that might have been imagination. My flashlight began to dim, the battery dying at the worst possible moment. In near-complete darkness, I felt my way along tunnel walls by touch, moving more slowly but hopefully with enough stealth to avoid detection. The concrete was slick with condensation and organic growth, covered in what felt like moss or fungus that came away on my fingers in slimy chunks. After what seemed like hours of blind stumbling, I saw a faint glow ahead, not artificial light, but the pale gray hint of dawn filtering down from above. An exit shaft, probably used for ventilation during construction and possibly forgotten by my pursuers. The shaft was vertical, roughly cylindrical, with rusted metal rungs embedded in the concrete walls. Many of the rungs had corroded away completely, leaving gaps that would require dangerous reaches between secure handholds. But it was my only chance of escape from the underground maze. I began climbing, testing each rung carefully before trusting it with my full weight. Several gave way as soon as I put pressure on them, the corroded metal fragmenting with sounds that echoed down the shaft like dropped coins. Behind and below me, lights appeared in the tunnel I'd just left. My pursuers had found the shaft entrance and were undoubtedly planning their own ascent. But they would have to climb more carefully than I could afford to, giving me a precious head start toward the surface. The climb seemed endless, each rung a gamble that might send me plummeting back into the darkness below. My arms burned with fatigue and my hands were bloody from gripping corroded metal. But the growing light above pulled me upward with the promise of freedom. When I finally hauled myself out of the shaft, dawn was breaking over the gorge in shades of gray and pale gold. I found myself on a hillside above the river, probably a mile downstream from where I had entered the tunnel system. The familiar sound of flowing water had never been more welcome, but I wasn't safe yet. Behind me, sounds of pursuit emerged from the ventilation shaft, scraping metal, labored breathing, angry voices discussing strategy in their evolved dialect. Whatever lived in those tunnels wasn't giving up easily. I stumbled downhill through dense undergrowth, ignoring branches that tore at my clothes and skin. The river grew louder with each step, promising escape from the nightmare that had consumed the last 2 days. When I finally broke through the vegetation onto the bank, I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the icy current, gasping as the shock nearly stole my breath. The water was deeper than expected, over my head in some places, forcing me to swim rather than wade. The current was strong but manageable, carrying me downstream and away from whatever still hunted me from the tunnels. I let the river do most of the work, conserving my strength while putting distance between myself and Deadwater Gap. After maybe an hour of alternately swimming and floating, I heard voices ahead, normal voices speaking recognizable English. 2 fly fishermen had set up on the bank near a deep pool, their equipment spread out in the organized chaos that spoke of serious anglers pursuing their sport. They shouted in alarm when they saw me emerge from the water like some kind of swamp creature, my clothes torn and bloody, my face probably bearing the wild expression of someone who had seen too much. One of them, a retired doctor as it turned out, immediately began treating me for hypothermia, while his companion called for emergency services on a satellite phone. I tried to explain what had happened, babbling about abandoned dam projects and tunnel-dwelling descendants of missing workers, but my words came out jumbled and incoherent. The paramedics who eventually arrived diagnosed severe hypothermia and possible delusional episodes brought on by exposure and exhaustion. They found my abandoned campsite later that day, torn apart exactly as I had described. But the official report attributed the damage to black bears, a convenient explanation that avoided uncomfortable questions about what might really inhabit the remote corners of the Nantahala National Forest. Weeks later, when I had physically recovered enough to return to Franklin, I sought out the old outfitter who had warned me about Deadwater Gap. His eyes narrowed when he recognized me, and without prompting he pulled a faded map from behind his counter. "Others have gone up there," he said quietly, tapping a gnarled finger on the spot marked Deadwater Gap. "Workers from the old dam project. State-hired families, brought them in from outside. Project folded in 27, left them stranded with no way out and no money to relocate." He paused, his weathered face creased with old sadness. Most of the adults eventually found ways to leave. Walked out through the mountains, caught rides when they could, started over somewhere else. But the children... His voice trailed off as he stared at the map. They never knew any other life. Born in the work camps, raised in the tunnels when winter came. When their parents left, they stayed behind because it was the only home they'd ever known. Been there ever since, living off the land, raising their own children the same way. I walked away that day knowing I would never return to that part of the river. The water belonged to something older now, a community that had adapted to abandonment by becoming part of the landscape itself. And sometimes, late at night when rain drums against my windows, I still hear the echo of rhythmic paddle strokes cutting through dark water, searching for visitors foolish enough to venture into Deadwater Gap. The maps still show the old dam site, but I've crossed out that section with permanent marker. Some discoveries aren't worth making, and some communities prefer to remain undisturbed by the outside world that once failed them so completely. The children of Dead Water Gap have found their own way to survive, and God help anyone curious enough to disturb their isolated peace. Looking back on that night in 2018, I realize how naive I was at 19. Jessica had this way of making even the most dangerous ideas sound reasonable, and I was desperate enough to impress her that I would have agreed to almost anything. When she mentioned the anti-fracking protest in rural Sussex, I nodded along enthusiastically, pretending I understood the environmental implications while really just watching the way her dark hair caught the afternoon light in the university cafe. "We need to make a real statement," she said, her green eyes burning with conviction. "Not just online petitions or peaceful marches. We need to physically block them from destroying that land." The word physically should have been my first warning, but I was too caught up in her passion to think clearly. When she suggested we go shopping for camping gear, my stomach dropped. This wasn't going to be a day trip with some sign waving and photo opportunities for social media. This was serious. The outdoor equipment store felt like a foreign country to me. I'd never been camping in my life, preferring the safety and comfort of my dorm room. Jessica moved through the aisles with confidence, selecting sleeping bags, portable stoves, and waterproof jackets, while I fumbled with tent poles and tried to look like I knew what I was doing. The salesperson, a weathered man in his 50s, kept giving me suspicious looks as I struggled to understand the difference between a 3-season and 4-season tent. "First time camping?" he asked, not bothering to hide his amusement. "No, of course not," I lied, my voice cracking slightly. "Just haven't been in a while." Jessica shot me a look that told me she wasn't fooled, but she didn't say anything. That was worse than if she'd called me out directly. The fear of disappointing her was already eating at me, and we hadn't even left the city yet. The drive to Sussex took 3 hours, during which Jessica explained the environmental devastation that fracking could cause. She spoke about contaminated groundwater, seismic activity, and the long-term effects on local wildlife. I nodded and made appropriate sounds of agreement, but my mind kept wandering to horror stories I'd heard about rural areas. Isolated places where cell phone signals died and help was miles away. As we left the main highways behind and entered the narrow, winding roads of the countryside, I felt increasingly disconnected from civilization. The rolling hills that probably looked picturesque in daylight seemed ominous under the darkening sky. Ancient stone walls lined the roads, and behind them, vast fields stretched into shadows. Every farmhouse we passed looked abandoned, their windows dark and unwelcoming. "This is it," Jessica announced as we turned down a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. My heart was already racing before I saw the protest site. About 40 tents were scattered along a muddy field beside the road, with more protesters arriving by the hour. A makeshift stage had been erected, and someone was testing a sound system, sending screeching feedback across the countryside. The whole scene looked temporary and vulnerable, like it could be swept away at any moment. The protest camp was more chaotic than I'd expected. People of all ages milled about, some clearly experienced activists with weathered faces and practical gear, others like me who looked out of place and unprepared. A group of university students had set up a banner reading, "Save Our Earth," in dripping red paint that looked unsettling in the fading light. Jessica immediately threw herself into organizing, helping newcomers find spots for their tents and explaining the planned strategy for blocking access to the drilling site. I tried to follow her around, but she was constantly pulled in different directions by other protesters who seemed to know her well. I began to realize this wasn't her first rodeo, and I was definitely out of my league. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped significantly. The wind picked up, causing the tents to flutter and snap like trapped animals. I'd borrowed a cheap tent from a friend, and it took me embarrassingly long to set up while Jessica efficiently assembled hers nearby. Other protesters offered help, but their patronizing smiles made it clear they could see I was a complete amateur. "You might want to secure those guy ropes better," suggested a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and calloused hands. "Weather forecast says strong winds tonight." I fumbled with the rope, trying to remember the knots Jessica had shown me in the store parking lot. The metal stakes seemed too flimsy to hold against any serious wind, and the thought of my tent collapsing in the middle of the night filled me with dread. A man with a grizzled beard and army surplus jacket had set up a portable barbecue and was cooking for anyone who wanted food. The smell of burning meat mixed with diesel fumes from generators powering the lights and sound equipment. As I waited in line for a burger, I overheard conversations that made my unease grow. "The locals aren't happy about us being here," someone was saying. "Heard they've been making threats." "What kind of threats?" asked another protester. "Property owners around here don't take kindly to trespassers. Some of them are old-school farmers who've been dealing with activists for years. They know how to make people disappear." The burger turned to cardboard in my mouth. I tried to tell myself it was just activist bravado, the kind of exaggeration that made protests sound more dangerous and important than they really were. But something about the way the conversation died when other people approached suggested there might be truth to the warnings. As the evening wore on, more protesters arrived, and the camp became increasingly crowded and noisy. Someone had brought speakers and was playing music that echoed off the surrounding hills. The sound system crackled and popped, occasionally emitting ear-piercing feedback that sent chills down my spine. In the distance, I could see the lights of isolated farmhouses, and I wondered what the locals thought of this invasion. Jessica found me sitting alone by my tent, staring into the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. "You seem nervous," she said, settling down beside me. "Just thinking about tomorrow," I lied. "About the actual protest." She studied my face in the flickering light from a nearby camping lantern. "This isn't what you expected, is it?" Before I could answer, a commotion erupted near the edge of the camp. Someone was shouting, and people were running toward the sound. We jumped up and followed, pushing through the crowd until we could see what was happening. A local farmer stood at the edge of the camp, his face red with anger. He was a big man, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush bones. Behind him, partially hidden in shadow, stood 2 other men who looked equally hostile. "You people need to move on," the farmer was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent his life giving orders. "This is private property and you're trespassing." One of the protest organizers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward with a clipboard and what looked like legal documents. "We have permits to be here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is public right-of-way." The farmer's laugh was harsh and mirthless. "Permits don't mean much out here, son. Especially not at night, when things can go wrong so easily." The threat was unmistakable, and I felt my mouth go dry. The crowd of protesters had formed a semicircle around the confrontation, but they suddenly seemed much smaller and more vulnerable than they had minutes before. Many of them were students like me, middle-class kids who'd never faced real violence or danger. "Are you threatening us?" asked the organizer, trying to inject authority into his voice. "I'm informing you," the farmer replied. "This is farm country. We don't much like outsiders stirring up trouble. Accidents happen out here. People get lost, hurt, sometimes worse. Cell phone coverage is spotty. Help is a long way off." As if to emphasize his point, I checked my phone and saw that I had no signal bars. The screen seemed dimmer than usual, and I realized the battery was already draining faster than normal in the cold. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. But the organizers weren't backing down. They started quoting laws and constitutional rights, their voices getting louder and more aggressive. The farmer's 2 companions stepped closer, their faces emerging from shadow to reveal expressions of barely contained hostility. One of them was chewing tobacco, occasionally spitting into the mud near the protesters' feet. "You have until sunrise," the farmer said finally. "After that, anyone still on this land is fair game." With that, the three men melted back into the darkness, leaving the protesters standing in stunned silence. The music and conversation gradually resumed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People spoke in hushed tones and kept glancing toward the perimeter of the camp, as if expecting the farmers to return at any moment. I tried to convince Jessica to pack up and leave immediately, but she was more determined than ever to stay. "If we run every time someone tries to intimidate us, we'll never accomplish anything," she said. "Besides, they're probably just trying to scare us. They wouldn't actually do anything." But I could see the doubt in her eyes, and I knew she was as frightened as I was. We returned to our tents, but neither of us was ready to sleep. The wind had picked up significantly, and the tent fabric snapped and billowed around us like something alive and angry. Every sound from outside, a branch breaking, footsteps on gravel, the distant call of an owl, made us both tense up. Around midnight, the generators powering the lights and sound system ran out of fuel. Someone had forgotten to bring extra gasoline, and within minutes the camp was plunged into near-total darkness. A few people had flashlights or camping lanterns, but they created more shadows than illumination, turning familiar shapes into threatening silhouettes. The temperature continued to drop, and I could hear people complaining about the cold. Some of the cheaper tents were already failing, their occupants forced to huddle together for warmth. The sound of chattering teeth and muffled conversations created an undercurrent of anxiety that made sleep impossible. I must have finally dozed off around 2 in the morning, because I was awakened by the sound of heavy boots on gravel and angry voices getting closer. At first I thought I was dreaming, but Jessica's sharp intake of breath told me the danger was real. "Get up! Everyone up!" someone was shouting. "They're coming!" I unzipped my tent flap and peered out to see pure chaos. Flashlight beams were sweeping across the camp, but they weren't being held by protesters. Dark figures were moving between the tents, and I could hear the distinctive sound of canvas being ripped. "Where are your permits now?" a gruff voice called out. "This is our land, and you're trespassing." The farmer from earlier emerged into the beam of someone's flashlight, but he wasn't alone. At least 6 men were with him, all carrying what looked like farming tools, pitchforks, shovels, and something that might have been a cattle prod. In the darkness, they looked like something from a nightmare. People were screaming and running in all directions. Some protesters tried to stand their ground, shouting about their legal rights, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the advancing locals. I saw one young man get shoved to the ground when he tried to block their path, his expensive camping gear scattered in the mud. "We need to go," Jessica said, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We didn't have time to pack properly. I managed to grab my jacket and shoes, but everything else, sleeping bag, camping gear, my car keys, was left behind in the tent. Jessica was wearing only the Spider-Man t-shirt she'd slept in, and a pair of shorts that offered no protection against the cold. The protesters were scattering in every direction, but most were heading toward the road and their parked cars. The problem was that the farmers seemed to have anticipated this, and several more men were blocking the main exit from the camp. In the darkness and confusion, it was impossible to see clearly, but I caught glimpses of more threatening figures positioned strategically around the perimeter. "This way," I said, pulling Jessica toward what looked like an opening in the stone wall that bordered the field. We climbed over the wall and found ourselves in another field, this one rough pasture that sloped away from the road. Behind us, we could still hear shouting and the sound of tent stakes being pulled from the ground. A woman was crying, and someone was calling for help in a voice that sounded genuinely terrified. The field was uneven and treacherous in the darkness. Several times I stumbled in holes that might have been rabbit burrows or drainage ditches. Jessica was struggling to keep up, her bare legs getting scratched by thorns and her thin t-shirt providing no warmth against the wind. "I can't see anything," she gasped. "Where are we going?" I didn't know. The field seemed to stretch endlessly downhill, and I had no idea which direction led to safety. Behind us, the lights and sounds of the confrontation were growing fainter, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing. It meant we were getting farther from help, not closer to it. The field ended at a line of trees that looked impenetrable in the darkness. I could hear water running somewhere nearby, a stream or river that might offer a path to follow. But as we got closer, I realized the sound was coming from below ground level. It was a drainage ditch or culvert, invisible until we were almost on top of it. Jessica stumbled and nearly fell into the water. I caught her arm just in time, but she let out a small cry of alarm that seemed to echo in the darkness. Immediately, we both froze, listening for any sign that we'd been heard. "This way," I whispered, helping her down into the shallow water. The ditch was only about 3 feet deep, but it was lined with smooth concrete that was slippery with algae and debris. The water was shockingly cold, immediately soaking through our shoes and numbing our feet. But it provided concealment and a clear path away from the camp. We waded downstream for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The concrete gave way to natural stream bed, rocky and uneven. Tree branches hung low over the water, forcing us to duck and sometimes crawl. My knees kept hitting submerged rocks, and I could feel warm blood mixing with the cold water. Jessica was shivering uncontrollably. Her teeth were chattering so loudly I was afraid the sound would give us away, even though we'd heard nothing from our pursuers for some time. Her Spider-Man t-shirt was soaked through and clinging to her skin, and in the moonlight that occasionally filtered through the tree canopy, she looked pale and fragile. "We need to get out of the water," I said. "You're going to get hypothermia." But when we tried to climb out of the stream, we found ourselves facing an almost vertical bank topped with dense, thorny undergrowth. We were trapped in a corridor of water and stone, with no choice but to keep moving forward. The stream eventually led us into a small wooded area that seemed completely isolated from civilization. Ancient oak trees towered overhead, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so thick that almost no moonlight penetrated to the ground. The silence was oppressive. No cars, no voices, no sound of the modern world. We stumbled through the underbrush, holding hands to avoid losing each other. Every few steps, one of us would trip over a root or run into a low branch. My face and arms were covered with scratches, and I could taste blood where a branch had caught my lip. "I think we're lost," Jessica whispered. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I had no idea which direction we'd been traveling or how far we'd come from the road. The trees all looked the same in the darkness, massive and ancient and somehow hostile. For all I knew, we were walking in circles. That's when we heard the voices. At first, I thought it might be other protesters who had also fled into the woods. But as the voices got closer, I recognized the harsh accent of the farmer who had confronted us earlier. He wasn't alone. I could make out at least 3 different voices, and they were coordinating their search in the methodical way of people who knew the terrain. "They went this way," someone was saying. "I found footprints by the stream." "Split up," the farmer's voice commanded. "Cover more ground. They can't have gone far in the dark." Jessica and I pressed ourselves against the trunk of a massive oak tree, hardly daring to breathe. Through the undergrowth, I could see occasional flashes of light as they swept the area with powerful flashlights. These weren't the small camping lights we'd been using. These were serious hunting lights that could illuminate large areas. "What do you think they'll do if they find us?" Jessica whispered directly into my ear. I didn't want to think about it. The farmer's earlier threats had been vague but unmistakably hostile. We were miles from help, with no cell phone signal and no way to contact anyone. Even if we could prove we hadn't technically broken any laws, that wouldn't matter if no one ever found our bodies. The search party was getting closer. I could hear branches breaking as they pushed through the underbrush, and their voices were becoming clearer. They were talking about teaching protesters a lesson, about making examples that would keep others from coming back. "Found something," one of them called out. Piece of fabric caught on a thorn. My heart stopped. Jessica looked down at her t-shirt and saw a tear I hadn't noticed before. The Spider-Man logo was partially ripped away, and she must have left evidence of our passage on the bushes we'd pushed through. Fresh, another voice confirmed. They came this way within the last hour. We had to move, but any movement would make noise that might give us away. The undergrowth was thick enough to provide concealment if we stayed low, but it was also full of dry branches and leaves that would crackle under our weight. I motioned for Jessica to follow me as I began crawling away from the search party. We moved incredibly slowly, testing each hand and knee placement before shifting our weight. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, even our own breathing. Behind us, the searchers had found our hiding spot by the oak tree. They were here. The farmer's voice was closer than ever. Still warm spots where they were sitting. Can't be far. The hunt was intensifying. I could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movements to surround the area where they thought we might be hiding. Their lights were sweeping back and forth in overlapping patterns, and it was only a matter of time before one of those beams found us. We had been crawling for what felt like hours when Jessica suddenly stopped moving. I turned back to see her frozen in place, staring at something ahead of us. Following her gaze, I saw him. One of the farmers standing about 20 feet away, his back to us as he examined something on the ground with his flashlight. He was alone, separated from the main search party. This was either our best chance to slip past undetected, or the moment where everything went terribly wrong. The man was enormous, even bigger than he'd looked at the camp. His shoulders were broad enough to block out most of the weak moonlight, and he moved with the confident ease of someone who'd spent his entire life in these woods. We were trying to back away slowly when Jessica's foot found the one dry branch in the entire forest. The crack was like a gunshot in the silence. The farmer spun around immediately, his flashlight beam sweeping across the undergrowth until it found us. For a moment, nobody moved. Jessica and I were caught like deer in headlights, crouched in the bushes with nowhere to run. "Well, well," he said, his voice calm and terrifyingly controlled. "Look what I found." He reached for something clipped to his belt, and my blood turned to ice when I saw it was a radio. All he had to do was call the others, and we'd be surrounded within minutes. "Please," I said, standing up slowly with my hands visible. "We're lost. We just want to get back to the road." He studied us for a long moment, his flashlight moving from my face to Jessica's. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. In her torn Spider-Man t-shirt and muddy shorts, she looked young and vulnerable. "You picked the wrong night to play activist," he said finally. "This isn't some city park where you can camp out and wave signs. This is working land, and we don't tolerate troublemakers." "We didn't mean any harm," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll leave. We'll never come back." The farmer laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you'll leave all right. Question is whether you leave walking or whether we carry you out." That's when I saw it, a hunting rifle slung across his back. In the darkness of the camp, I'd missed it, but now the moonlight caught the metal and made it unmistakable. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a man with a weapon who had us completely at his mercy. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This was my idea. I talked Jessica into coming. If you're going to do something, do it to me. Let her go." It was a lie, and Jessica shot me a look that said she knew it. But I was hoping the gesture might confuse him enough to give us some kind of advantage. The farmer considered this for a moment, then reached for his radio again. But before he could key it, a new sound cut through the silence. Sirens in the distance, growing louder. Someone at the camp must have called the police. The farmer heard it too, and his expression changed from predatory confidence to something like concern. Whatever he'd been planning to do to us, he couldn't do it with law enforcement on the way. The sound of sirens seemed to transform everything. The farmer stepped back, his aggressive posture shifting to something more defensive. He was no longer the predator. Now he was just as vulnerable as we were, maybe more so. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. "You tell your friends what happened here tonight. Tell them what happens to people who don't know when they're not wanted." With that, he melted back into the trees, leaving Jessica and me alone in the darkness. We didn't wait to see if he was really gone. Hand in hand, we crashed through the undergrowth toward the sound of the sirens, no longer caring about the noise we made. It took us another hour to find our way back to something resembling civilization. We emerged from the woods onto a narrow country road just as the first police cars were arriving at the protest site. In the distance, we could see the flashing lights and hear voices calling for order. A police officer found us stumbling along the road, two muddy, exhausted young people who looked like they'd been through a war. Jessica was hypothermic and covered in scratches, and I had a cut on my forehead that was still bleeding. We must have looked like crime victims because the officer immediately called for an ambulance. At the hospital, we gave statements to the police about what had happened. But our story sounded almost unbelievable even to us. Local farmers with weapons hunting protesters through the woods like animals. The investigating officers were polite but skeptical, especially when they couldn't find the farmers we described. The protest camp had been completely destroyed. Tents were scattered and torn, equipment was missing or damaged, and most of the protesters had fled. The few who remained claimed they'd been attacked by a large group of locals, but their accounts varied widely, and many were too traumatized to give coherent statements. Jessica and I were released from the hospital the next morning. Her parents drove down from London to pick her up, and I could see the disappointment and fear in their eyes as they looked at their daughter, scratched, exhausted, and clearly traumatized by the night's events. We never dated. The shared terror of that night had created a bond between us, but it wasn't romantic. It was the kind of connection formed by people who'd survived something dangerous together. We remained friends, but we rarely talked about what had happened in those woods. The fracking project went ahead as planned. Despite all our efforts, all the risk and terror we'd endured, the drilling began 6 months later. The local newspaper ran a small article about environmental protesters who had illegally camped on private property and been removed by police. There was no mention of armed farmers or people being hunted through the woods. Sometimes I wonder if the whole thing was planned. If the locals had done this before to other groups of protesters, using fear and violence to drive them away before their cause could gain any momentum. The timing was too perfect, their organization too efficient, for it to have been spontaneous. I learned something important that night. Good intentions aren't enough to protect you from people who are willing to use violence to protect their interests. The world isn't divided into heroes and villains like in comic books. It's full of ordinary people who will do terrible things when they feel threatened or cornered. Years later, I still have nightmares about being hunted through those woods. In my dreams, I never make it to the road. The sirens never come. And the farmer with the rifle always finds me in the end. But I also learned something about myself that night. When Jessica was in danger, I was willing to lie and take the blame to protect her. When we were lost and scared, I was able to think clearly enough to find a way out. Maybe I wasn't as useless as I'd always believed. I never went to another protest. Some people might call that cowardice, but I call it wisdom. There are other ways to change the world that don't involve putting yourself at the mercy of armed strangers in the middle of nowhere. The memory of that night, the cold water, the scratching branches, the sound of hunters calling to each other in the darkness, was enough to cure me of any romantic notions about activism. Jessica went on to become a lawyer specializing in environmental law. She fights her battles in courtrooms now, where the weapons are words and precedents instead of rifles and threats. I think she learned the same lesson I did that night, that good causes don't justify bad tactics, and that sometimes the best way to win is to choose the right battlefield. The scar on my forehead has faded over the years, but I still touch it sometimes when I'm telling this story. It's my reminder of the night I learned that the real world is much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined, and that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to keep moving forward even when you're terrified. I pray to God sometimes that other young people won't have to learn these lessons the hard way. But I know they will, because every generation has to discover for themselves that the world isn't as safe or fair as they were raised to believe. That night in the woods changed both of us forever. We went in as naive college students looking for adventure and came out as something different, older, wiser, and perhaps a little broken. But we came out alive, and in the end, that's what mattered most. Folks around here call me Rusty. Not because of my hair, that went gray years ago, but more for my, shall we say, colorful past. I've always been a bit of a drifter, you see. Spent most of my life wandering from one dead-end town to another, working odd jobs here and there. Construction mostly, though I had a stint trapping in Alaska that'd make your hair stand on end. I never was one for settling down. The thought of a mortgage and a mailbox with my name on it made my skin crawl. So, I'd take my old beat-up Ford and whatever cash I had on hand, and I'd hit the road whenever that familiar itch started creeping up my spine. This time, about 6 months back, I found myself in the northern reaches of Minnesota's boundary waters, a little speck on the map called Loon's Hollow. Yeah, I know. Sounds like something out of a postcard, don't it? But let me tell you, that place had seen better days. Used to be a bustling logging town back in the day, but once the big trees vanished, so did most of the folks. I rented a rundown cabin on the outskirts of Voyageurs National Park, figuring a few months of quiet and fishing was just what I needed to clear my head. And let me tell you, there's quiet, and then there's Boundary Waters quiet. The kind that rings in your ears at first, makes you think you're going deaf. Now, I'm not the type to get spooked at a few bumps in the night. Hell, I've slept under open skies with nothing but a bedroll between me and whatever critters might be prowling. But even those first few weeks, alone in that old cabin, well, the woods have a way of getting into your head. You know those long, inky black nights where the darkness seems to press in on you from all sides. The way the branches whisper and sigh, even when there's not a breath of wind. How shadows flicker at the edge of your vision, just beyond the reach of your flashlight. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, that it was the city boy in me still adjusting to the deep woods. But deep down, I knew better. It started with little things. Nothing you could put your finger on, just stuff that could be explained away if you tried hard enough. Food going missing from the cabin. My fishing gear getting tangled up, even though I knew I'd put it away neat and tidy. One morning I found tracks circling my cabin, wide like a bear had waltzed through, but with toes all wrong. Nothing too scary on its own, but enough to put me on edge. See, I've been around the block a time or two, and I know the difference between a critter looking for scraps and something else. There was a feeling in the air, heavy and wrong, like being watched by eyes you couldn't see. That's when I started going out later, once the tourists cleared out for the day and true night started to settle in. I'd take long walks on the trails, flashlight in hand. Told myself it was to get the lay of the land. But really, I think some part of me wanted to see what was out there. Wanted to prove to myself I hadn't gone soft in my old age. One night, about a month into my stay, I finally got my wish. The trail had taken me further into the park than usual. The moon barely a sliver through the dense canopy overhead. The further I walked, the thicker the darkness seemed to get, pressing in like a physical weight. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A snap of a branch, too loud to be a deer or even a moose. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to break free. Slowly, I swung the weak beam of my flashlight across the trees. At first, nothing but those long-reaching shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Then, just for a second, 2 pinpricks of light flickered back at me. high above the forest floor. Too high for any animal I knew, way too high. Before I could do anything, they were gone, vanished into the all-consuming blackness. I stood there frozen, feeling ice cold despite the summer night. I knew those weren't the eyes of anything normal, anything that belonged in these woods. And even then, the stubborn part of me argued. Tricks of the light, shadows, some nocturnal bird I didn't recognize. I convinced myself to walk back, trying to chalk the whole thing up to a bad case of the spooks. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of wrongness settled on my shoulders like a shroud. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was watching me, it wasn't done. The next morning, I went into town and bought a whole mess of supplies. Canned food, batteries, extra ammo, anything I reckoned would last me a while if push came to shove. Didn't tell a soul why I was stocking up. They'd likely just laugh at the old man going crazy out in the sticks. I told myself it was better that way. That was when the disappearances started. Folks going missing out on the trails, campers mostly. Search parties found nothing but ripped tents or abandoned gear, if that. The locals grew jumpy, whispering old stories about things that stalked the deep woods. I kept my mouth shut, knowing exactly what those shadows held, and the part it had in the missing folks. Guilt gnawed at me, knowing I could have warned them. But some part of me, a dark, reckless part, was curious. Wanted to see what I was truly dealing with. I spent the next weeks hunkered down in my cabin, studying the woods, listening for the sounds that weren't supposed to be there. It came in snatches, a mournful howl that raised the hair on the back of my neck, the cracking of underbrush too heavy and deliberate to belong to any deer. It was hunting, stalking, circling like a wolf around dying prey. And I was the prey. Then, a few days ago, a break in the monotony. I was out restocking my firewood when I spotted it. Massive, even in the twilight, hunched and hairy, standing stock still near the tree line. Its head swiveled, and I caught a flash of, well, not exactly eyes. More like voids, pits of blackness in its shadowed face. They seemed to drink in the light, sucking away any warmth or life around them. I didn't wait around to admire the view. I dropped my axe and took off running back to the cabin. I could hear it lumbering after me, its footsteps booming like drums against the quiet of the forest. I barely made it inside, slamming the door shut and scrambling for my rifle. I hunkered down behind a window, peering out at the tree line, trying to catch sight of it. The silence stretched on, taut as a bowstring. My heart pounded in my ears, nearly drowning out the quiet whisper that slithered into my head. It knows where you are. The thing was playing with me, just like a cat with a cornered mouse. Then I saw it again, bolder this time. It stepped out of the trees, silhouetted against the dusky sky. It stood easily 10 feet tall, maybe 12, and its shoulders were wider than my old truck. Muscle and fur rippled under its thick, dark hide as it strode across my clearing, each step a silent thump of monstrous power. It tilted its head, and those awful pits that were its eyes fixated on my window. It seemed to stare right through me, piercing my hiding spot and seeing something more than just the scared man barricaded inside. It opened its maw in a silent snarl, revealing rows of teeth like railroad spikes. And then it charged. I slammed the rifle up against my shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The blast rattled the old cabin's windows. The creature let out a roar of pain, or maybe surprise. It reared back, clutching at a ragged wound in its massive chest. Even with the dim light, I could see the blood, dark and glistening, pumping from the hole. It wouldn't be enough to kill the thing, but maybe it would slow it down enough for me to get away. I didn't stick around to see. I bolted towards the back of the cabin, my clumsy feet thundering against the wooden floor. I had a half-baked plan, or at least a gamble, tucked in the back of my mind. There was a second door leading out to a rickety shed. And in that shed, my stash of trapping gear and supplies. If I was lucky, I might just have a chance. I burst from the back of the cabin and lunged towards the shed, fumbling with the rusty latch with trembling hands. Inside, the air was musty and stale, smelling of old grease and metal. My eyes darted frantically across the cramped space, searching for what I needed. There, a roll of heavy gauge wire, a couple of old rusted bear traps, and a few tools scavenged from various roadside stops over the years. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Working fast, my fingers raw and clumsy with fear, I rigged a crude snare with the wire. I used a sapling to set up a tripwire, praying the creature was more brawn than brains. The thing was close, its heavy footsteps pounding through the undergrowth as it stalked me. I grabbed one last thing, a bottle of kerosene from the shelf, and retreated back to the cabin, shoving the heavy old dresser against the back door for good measure. I heard a grunt of frustration as it slammed against the barricade. I could almost see it, furious and bewildered, trying to smash its way through. Good. Buy me a few precious minutes. I crouched behind the window overlooking the clearing, rifle clutched in my white-knuckled hands. I doused the floor in front of the window with the kerosene, the harsh smell filling the room and making my stomach churn. There was no time for second thoughts. It broke through the trees and into the open. Even injured, it moved with terrifying speed. But I was ready for it. I pulled the lighter from my pocket, flicked it on, and tossed it onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The flames whooshed up, a wall of fire between me and the monstrous form now charging the cabin. It howled, stumbling back from the blaze, but it wasn't giving up. The thing started circling my makeshift fortress, searching for a way in, and then I saw it. The shed. My half-finished trap. There was no hesitation this time. I burst from the side door of the cabin, sprinting towards the shed. Just like I hoped, the creature lurched after me, its eyes fixed on me as I stumbled through the open shed door. I heard the whomp as it smashed into the thin wooden wall, the sound of splintering boards filling the air. I spun around, slamming the shed door shut behind me as the monster's massive claws tore through the wood. But I was ready. I jammed the rusted bear traps into the floorboards on either side of the door, then looped the wire around the handle. I braced myself as the creature slammed its weight against the wood once, twice, 3 times. The door bulged inward, groaning ominously. But then I heard the snap. A howl, louder and more anguished than before, echoed through the forest. I risked a peek around the doorframe. One massive leg was caught fast in the bear trap, tethered to the door handle by my makeshift wire. The creature thrashed and roared, trying to wrench itself free. My window of opportunity was open. I grabbed my rifle, steadied my aim at the massive beast, and fired. Again and again. Each blast echoed through the trees, each strike making the monster bellow and buck. Finally, with one last deafening roar, it went still, its hulking form slumped on the forest floor. I stayed crouched beside the shed long after the sounds of the struggle faded. I didn't move until the first weak rays of dawn cut through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage, I ventured out. It lay there, unmoving, a testament to the night's terrifying battle. Cautiously, I poked at the colossal body with my rifle barrel. Dead. Finally dead. I collapsed to the ground in exhaustion, relief washing over me like cleansing rain. I had survived. It took 2 days before the sheriff and the park rangers arrived, drawn by the gunshots and the reports of a disturbance from the folks in town. I still remember the look on their faces when I led them back to the clearing and showed them the dead creature, its existence denying everything they'd ever thought possible. Some called me crazy, said it was a bear, a hoax, but the ones who lived in those parts, the ones who had listened to the whispers in the woods for years, they believed me. They finally saw the truth in what I was saying. They started calling the creature the Boundary Beast, maybe on account of its enormous size, or maybe as a way to reclaim some kind of control over the unexplainable that lurked in their forests. It had been there, stalking them all along, hidden in the shadows of their campfire tales. I didn't stay in Loon's Hollow long after that. Sold the cabin, packed up my old truck, and drove until the road ran out. Every now and then, though, late at night, I still hear the crunch of heavy footsteps. I still see those hollow pits that seem to swallow the light, burning into my memory. I've always been a wanderer, but I reckon a part of me will always linger in those northern woods, a solitary watchman against the ancient darkness. And sometimes, on nights when the wind howls just right, I wonder, was it really the only one of its kind? The weeks following the Boundary Beast's demise were a blur of police statements, ranger interviews, and hushed conversations in Loon's Hollow's only diner. I tried to keep a low profile, but in a town that small, news travels faster than wildfire. Some folks treated me like a hero, offering free drinks and slaps on the back. Others, well, let's just say they weren't too keen on having their quiet little corner of the world thrust into the spotlight. Can't say I blamed them. It was during one of those late-night diner visits that I met her. Evelyn Blackwood, the local librarian and amateur historian. She was a tall, willowy woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. "Mr. Russell," she said, sliding into the booth across from me without invitation. "I believe we need to talk." I eyed her warily over my coffee mug. "About what exactly?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About what you saw out there in the woods. About what's been happening in this area for a lot longer than most folks realize." And just like that, I was pulled into a world I never knew existed, right beneath the surface of Loon's Hollow. Over the next few days, Evelyn and I pored over old town records, newspaper clippings, and handwritten journals passed down through generations. The story that emerged was enough to chill my blood. The Boundary Beast, or creatures like it, had been terrorizing the area for centuries. Native American legends spoke of shadow walkers and skin stealers. Early settlers told tales of monstrous bears that walked like men. Every few decades, a rash of disappearances would occur, only to fade from memory as time passed. But why? I asked Evelyn one night as we sat surrounded by piles of dusty books. "Why does it keep coming back?" She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "That's the question, isn't it? Some say it's a guardian, protecting these lands from outsiders. Others believe it's a manifestation of the forest's anger at being exploited. But the truth? I think the truth is far older and darker than we can comprehend. As fascinating as our research was, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were poking a sleeping bear, or something far worse. My suspicions were confirmed a week later when I returned to my cabin to find the place ransacked. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, and scrawled on the wall in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Leave it alone." I called the sheriff, of course, but I knew this was beyond his jurisdiction. This was a warning, plain and simple. But from who? Or what? That night, unable to sleep in the violated cabin, I drove into town and checked into the small motel on Main Street. As I lay in bed staring at the water-stained ceiling, a realization hit me like a freight train. The Boundary Beast I killed. It wasn't alone. The next morning I went straight to Evelyn's house, my mind racing with possibilities. But as I pulled up, I knew something was wrong. The front door stood ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Evelyn?" I called out, my hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at my hip. No answer. I found her in the study, surrounded by scattered papers and overturned bookshelves. She was alive, thank God, but badly shaken. A deep gash ran across her forehead, and her eyes were wide with fear. "They came," she whispered as I helped her to her feet. "They know we know." We spent the next hour gathering every scrap of information we could and shoving it into my truck. Whatever had attacked Evelyn, whatever had ransacked my cabin, it wanted to keep the truth buried. But we weren't about to let that happen. As we drove out of town, heading for the relative safety of Duluth, Evelyn filled me in on what she'd discovered in the hours before the attack. The boundary beasts, she said, her voice still shaky. They're not just monsters. They're guardians of something. Something ancient and powerful buried deep in the boundary waters. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Guardians? You mean there's more than one? She nodded grimly. A whole pack of them, if the old stories are to be believed. And killing one, well, you've stirred up the hornet's nest, Rusty. The implication hung heavy in the air between us. By defending myself, by killing the beast, I'd set something in motion. Something big. We spent the next few weeks in Duluth, poring over the documents we'd salvaged and reaching out to contacts Evelyn had in the world of paranormal research. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The boundary beasts were indeed guardians, but not of a place. They were protectors of a secret, a power that had existed in the northern woods since time immemorial. Some called it the heart of the forest, others the primal source. Whatever it was old, it was powerful, and it was waking up. Our research was interrupted one stormy night by a pounding on the door of our rented apartment. I opened it to find a soaking wet man, his eyes wild with fear. "Are you Russell?" he gasped. "The one who killed the beast?" I nodded, ushering him inside. His name was Michael Hawkins, and he was a forest ranger from Voyageurs National Park. What he told us over the next hour made my blood run cold. Strange occurrences had been escalating in the park since my encounter with the beast. Trees moving on their own. Lakes that seemed to breathe. And worst of all, more sightings of creatures that matched the description of the one I'd killed. "It's like the whole forest is alive," Michael said, his hands shaking as he clutched a mug of coffee. "And it's angry." Evelyn and I exchanged glances. We knew what we had to do. The next morning, we packed up Michael's truck with every weapon and piece of survival gear we could get our hands on. Our ragtag group of 3, a wanderer, a librarian, and a forest ranger, headed back into the heart of the boundary waters. The drive was tense, filled with uneasy silence punctuated by Michael's directions. As we got closer to Loon's Hollow, the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on us from all sides. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We made camp that night in a small clearing, the fire doing little to push back the oppressive darkness. None of us slept much, our ears straining for any sound out of place. It was just before dawn when we heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We were on our feet in an instant, weapons at the ready. They came from the trees, massive shapes moving with unnatural silence. 1, 2, 3, 5 in total. Boundary beasts, each as terrifying as the one I'd faced before. What followed was a battle unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Gunshots echoed through the trees, mingling with inhuman roars and the sound of rending flesh. Michael went down early, swatted aside by a massive paw. Evelyn proved surprisingly handy with a shotgun, her face set in grim determination. I lost track of time, lost in a haze of adrenaline and fear. But slowly, impossibly, we began to gain the upper hand. One beast fell, then another. The remaining 3 retreated into the trees, their howls fading into the distance. As the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, we stood in the blood-soaked clearing, battered but alive. Michael was hurt bad, but breathing. Evelyn's silver hair was matted with blood and leaves. But it wasn't over. We all felt it. This was just the beginning. Over the next few days, as Michael recovered and we tended to our wounds, we pushed deeper into the boundary waters. The forest around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. More than once, we caught glimpses of shadowy figures flitting between the trees, always just out of reach. It was Evelyn who finally figured it out. "The heart," she said one night as we huddled around our meager fire. "All the old stories point to it. It's the source of the beast's power, and it's waking up." "Waking up?" I asked. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, frustration evident on her face. I'm not sure. But I think by killing that first beast, you disrupted some kind of balance. And now whatever force controls them is stirring. The implications were staggering. We weren't just dealing with a pack of monsters. We were up against something far older, far more powerful. Our search led us to an ancient, gnarled oak tree, larger than any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was easily 30 feet across, its branches reaching up to scrape the sky. And at its base, a cave entrance that seemed to swallow all light. We knew, without having to say it, that this was it. The heart of the forest. The source of all the terror that had plagued these woods for centuries. What we found inside that cave would haunt me for the rest of my days. Ancient carvings covered the walls depicting scenes of primordial chaos and cosmic horror. And at the center, a pulsing mass of something. Not quite plant, not quite animal. It writhed and twisted, giving off a sickly green light. The beasts were there too, standing guard around the pulsing mass. But they didn't attack. They watched us with those pitch-black eyes, waiting. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand reaching out towards the writhing mass. "It's dying," she said, her voice filled with wonder and sorrow. "The balance is broken, and it's dying." I didn't understand, not really. But I knew we had a choice to make. We could end this, destroy the heart, and ensure the beasts would never threaten anyone again. Or, in the end, it was Michael who made the decision. Still weak from his injuries, he staggered forward and placed his hand on the pulsing mass. There was a flash of green light, so bright it seared my eyes. When my vision cleared, Michael was gone. In his place stood a new beast, its fur the same rich brown as Michael's hair had been. It turned those fathomless black eyes on us, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition. Evelyn and I backed out of the cave slowly, our minds reeling from what we'd witnessed. As we emerged into the sunlight, we felt a change in the air. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest was gone, replaced by a sense of balance. We never saw Michael or the beasts again after that day. But sometimes when I'm out in the deep woods and the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the sound of heavy footsteps and a familiar, mournful howl. Evelyn and I tried to return to our normal lives. But how do you go back after something like that? We kept in touch, continuing our research, always watching for signs that the balance might be disrupted again. Years have passed since then. I'm an old man now. My wandering days long behind me. But I still find myself drawn to the deep woods, to the places where the veil between our world and the unknown grows thin. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the shadows seem to dance, I wonder, did we do the right thing? Did we save the world or merely postpone an inevitable reckoning? I suppose I'll never know for sure. But one thing I do know. The boundary waters keep their secrets well. And for those brave or foolish enough to go looking, there are wonders and terrors beyond imagining, waiting in the shadows of the northern woods. The steady hum of tires on asphalt filled the cramped interior of Thomas's old Subaru Outback as we wound our way up the California coast. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that promised adventure and whispered of change. I'm Tyson, by the way, and this trip was meant to be our escape, a chance for 4 lifelong friends to shed the shackles of our mundane lives and reconnect with something primal. Thomas, our self-appointed navigator, hunched over the steering wheel, his eyes flicking between the winding road and the GPS. In the passenger's seat, Carter scrolled through his phone, occasionally rattling off trivia about Redwood National Park, our destination. Mark sprawled across the back seat next to me, dozing fitfully, a light snore punctuating the road noise. "Did you know?" Carter piped up, his voice tinged with that infectious enthusiasm he always got when sharing random facts. "That some of these redwoods are over 2,000 years old. Imagine what they've seen." Thomas grunted noncommittally, too focused on navigating a particularly sharp turn. I leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. That's wild, man. Makes you feel pretty small, doesn't it? Carter nodded, his eyes alight. And get this. There are parts of the forest so dense that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. They call it the Twilight Zone. A chill ran down my spine at those words, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the morning mist clung to the roadside, obscuring the depths of the forest beyond. Or perhaps it was some primal instinct, a warning whisper from our ancestors who knew all too well the dangers that lurked in the shadows of ancient woods. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to pre-adventure jitters. This was our thing, after all. Every year, we'd pick a new wilderness to explore, pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones and into the great unknown. It kept life interesting, gave us stories to tell around water coolers and at dinner parties. How much longer? Mark mumbled, finally stirring from his nap. Thomas glanced at the GPS. About an hour, I think. We'll hit the visitor center, grab our permits, and then it's pure backcountry from there. I grinned, the excitement building. Off the grid, gentlemen. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us and Mother Nature in all her glory. If only I had known then how those words would come back to haunt me. How that glorious mother would reveal herself to be a cruel mistress, harboring secrets far darker than we could have imagined. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. In that moment, as we crested another hill and caught our first glimpse of the towering redwoods in the distance, all I felt was a sense of wonder and anticipation. The mist began to thin as we approached the park entrance, revealing glimpses of the colossal trees that awaited us. Their massive trunks stretched skyward, disappearing into a canopy so high it seemed to touch the clouds. It was humbling and awe-inspiring all at once. "Holy shit," Mark breathed, now fully awake and pressed against the window. "They're even bigger than I imagined." We fell into a reverent silence as Thomas navigated the winding park road. The trees seemed to close in around us, creating a natural tunnel that transported us from the familiar world of highways and gas stations into something altogether more primeval. The visitor center was a low, unassuming building that seemed dwarfed by its surroundings. We piled out of the car, stretching cramped limbs and breathing in the crisp forest air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs, invigorating after hours of recycled car air. As Thomas went to sort out our backcountry permits, Carter, Mark, and I wandered over to a large topographical map of the park displayed near the entrance. Carter immediately began pointing out potential routes, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of adventure. "Look at this area," he said, tracing a finger along a remote section of the map. "It's called the Lost Coast. Barely any established trails, just pure wilderness." Mark frowned, a note of concern in his voice. "I don't know, man. Shouldn't we stick to marked trails for our first time out here?" I clapped him on the shoulder, feeling a surge of bravado. "Where's your sense of adventure, Mark? We didn't come all this way to follow some tourist path." Little did I know how prophetic Mark's caution would prove to be. If we had stuck to those well-worn trails, perhaps our story would have ended differently. But fate, it seems, had other plans for us in those ancient woods. Thomas returned, a bundle of maps and our backcountry permit in hand. "We're all set," he announced. "They gave us a heads up about some trail closures due to recent storm damage, but we should be good to go for our planned route." We gathered our gear from the car, double-checking supplies and adjusting our heavy packs. The weight settled on my shoulders, a comforting reminder of the adventure that lay ahead. As we stepped onto the trailhead, leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization, I felt a familiar thrill course through me. The path ahead disappeared into the shadows of the forest. An invitation and a challenge all at once. We exchanged grins, our excitement palpable. With a deep breath of that intoxicating forest air, we took our first steps into the unknown. The dense canopy above cast the forest floor into a perpetual twilight, shafts of sunlight breaking through only occasionally to dapple the ground with golden spots. The air grew cooler as we ventured deeper, the sounds of the outside world fading away, until all we could hear was the crunch of our boots on the trail and the occasional call of a distant bird. As we hiked, Carter kept up a steady stream of facts about the forest and its inhabitants. Did you know that redwoods can grow to over 300 feet tall? That's as high as a 30-story building. Yeah, and I bet they don't have elevators, Mark quipped, already breathing heavily under the weight of his pack. We laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the hushed forest. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard something else. A rustle in the underbrush, perhaps, or the snap of a twig. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but the endless sea of trees stretching in every direction. As the day wore on, the trail began to climb, leading us up into the heart of the ancient forest. The trees, if possible, seemed to grow even larger, their massive trunks so wide that it would take all four of us linking arms to encircle them. We paused in a small clearing, catching our breath and taking in the majesty of our surroundings. Thomas pulled out the map, frowning slightly as he tried to orient himself. "I think we're here," he said, pointing to a spot on the wrinkled paper. "If we push on for another couple of hours, we should reach a good camping spot near a stream." I nodded, taking a long pull from my water bottle. "Sounds good. How are you holding up, Mark?" Mark grimaced, rolling his shoulders. "I'll live. Remind me again why we do this to ourselves?" Carter grinned, clapping him on the back. "For the stories, my friend. And the beer always tastes better when you've earned it." As we prepared to set off again, I noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, had gone eerily quiet. A heavy stillness settled over us, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the towering trees. "Anyone else notice that?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The others paused, looking around with furrowed brows. "Yeah," Thomas said slowly. "That's weird, right?" Before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling screech tore through the air, causing us all to jump. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with an undeniable sense of rage and hunger. "What the fuck was that?" Mark hissed, his face pale. Carter tried to laugh it off, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. "Probably just a mountain lion or something. No big deal, right?" But as we stood there, hearts pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something in that otherworldly cry had awakened a primal fear in me, a sense that we had stumbled into a place where we did not belong. Let's just keep moving," Thomas said, his voice tight. "We want to reach the campsite before dark." We set off again, our earlier camaraderie replaced by a tense silence. Each snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us flinch, our eyes constantly scanning the shadowy forest around us. The joy of exploration had been replaced by a growing sense of unease, a feeling that we were no longer the ones doing the watching. As the light began to fade, painting the forest in deepening shades of gray, we finally reached the clearing Thomas had identified on the map. A small stream burbled nearby, providing a soothing counterpoint to the oppressive silence that had followed us for miles. We began to set up camp with practiced efficiency, though I noticed we all stayed closer together than usual. No one wanted to stray too far into the gathering darkness alone. As Thomas got a fire going, its warm light pushing back the encroaching shadows, I felt some of the tension begin to ease. Carter cracked open the cooler, passing around beers with a forced grin. "See? Told you it would taste better out here." We clinked our cans together, a quiet toast to survival and friendship. As we sat around the fire, its flames casting flickering shadows on the massive tree trunks surrounding our little haven, I tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread that had settled over me. "So, I said, breaking the uneasy silence. Who's up for one of Carter's famous campfire stories? Carter perked up, always eager for an audience. Oh, you guys are gonna love this one. It's about a bear, a roll of toilet paper, and the most embarrassed hiker you've ever seen. As he launched into his tale, gesticulating wildly and doing different voices for each character, I felt myself starting to relax. This was familiar territory. Friends, laughter, the simple pleasure of a cold beer after a long day's hike. But even as we chuckled at Carter's punchline, I couldn't help but notice how quickly the laughter died away, swallowed by the vast, watching silence of the forest. And as I gazed into the impenetrable darkness beyond our firelight, I couldn't shake the feeling that our real story, the one that would haunt us for years to come, was only just beginning. As the last echoes of our laughter faded into the night, a heavy stillness settled over our campsite. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness, briefly illuminating the looming silhouettes of the ancient redwoods that surrounded us. I found my eyes drawn to the shadows between the trees, searching for... what? I wasn't sure, but an undeniable sense of unease had taken root in the pit of my stomach. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the silence. So, who's up for some grub? I packed those fancy dehydrated meals. We murmured in agreement, grateful for the distraction. As Thomas busied himself with the camping stove, I noticed Mark staring intently into the forest, his brow furrowed. You okay, man? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He started, as if pulled from a trance. Yeah, just thought I saw something move out there. Probably nothing. Carter laughed, but it sounded forced. Dude, your imagination is working overtime. It's just trees and shadows. But as I followed Mark's gaze, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness beyond our campfire was somehow deeper, more alive than it should be. The branches of the towering redwoods seemed to reach toward us, like gnarled fingers grasping at the edges of our sanctuary of light. Thomas returned with our rehydrated meals, the steam rising from the packets, a poor imitation of home-cooked comfort. We ate in relative silence, the usual banter and jokes conspicuously absent. Even Carter, normally a non-stop chatterbox, seemed subdued. As we finished our meal, I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. A chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place. Something earthy and ancient, with an underlying note of decay. Anyone else smell that? I asked, wrinkling my nose. The others paused, sniffing the air. Thomas shrugged. Just smells like forest to me. Maybe a little damp. But Mark's face had gone pale. No, I smell it too. It's like something rotting. A memory stirred in the back of my mind. A half-forgotten nature documentary about predators and the scent of death. I pushed the thought away, unwilling to give voice to the growing dread that clawed at the edges of my consciousness. Carter, ever the pragmatist, stood up and stretched. Well, whatever it is, I'm beat. Think I'm gonna turn in. Early start tomorrow, right? We nodded in agreement, the prospect of sleep suddenly very appealing. At least in our tents, we could pretend we were somewhere else, somewhere safe and familiar. As we doused the fire and retreated to our tents, I couldn't help but feel like we were making a terrible mistake. The darkness rushed in to fill the void left by our fading firelight, and with it came a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside me. Sleep eluded me, my mind racing with half-formed fears and wild speculations. Every rustle of wind through the trees, every snap of a twig in the underbrush, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I'm not sure how long I lay there, trapped between wakefulness and uneasy dreams, before I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep I felt it in my bones before I consciously registered the sound. Thomas stirred beside me, sitting up abruptly. Did you hear that? he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime forest sounds. Then, a heavy footfall, much too close to our tent. Another. Whatever was out there, it was big. Should we wake the others? Thomas breathed, his eyes wide in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. Before I could answer, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. It was Mark's voice, twisted into a sound of pure terror that made my blood run cold. We burst out of our tent, flashlights in hand, to find a scene of chaos. Mark's tent was in tatters, and he was sprawled on the ground, scrambling backward on all fours. Carter stood frozen, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the clearing. And there, at the edge of our campsite, was something. In the frantic, shifting light of our flashlights, I caught glimpses of matted fur, of yellowed fangs, of eyes that glowed with an unholy intelligence. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its massive size, always staying just at the edge of our vision. "What the fuck is that thing?" Carter yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The creature, for I couldn't bring myself to call it an animal, let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It was a sound that spoke of ancient hunger, of patience rewarded, of the inevitability of the hunt. "Run!" I screamed, my paralysis finally breaking. "Into the trees! Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. Abandoning our camp, we plunged into the darkness of the forest. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us at every step, but blind terror drove us forward. The sound of our ragged breathing and pounding footsteps seemed deafening in the oppressive silence of the forest. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder and more frenzied. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly, offering only terrifying glimpses of the world around us. Gnarled tree roots, low-hanging branches, the occasional flash of eyes reflecting in the darkness. "Keep going," Thomas yelled from somewhere to my left. "Don't look back." But human nature is a curious thing. Even in our terror, there's a part of us that needs to understand, to see the face of the danger pursuing us. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was closer than I'd thought, close enough that I could make out details I'd have preferred not to see. Its body was massive, easily the size of a bear, but with a lean, almost emaciated look. Matted fur clung to its frame in patches, revealing skin that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was almost human, but twisted, elongated in ways that defied natural anatomy. Yellowish fangs protruded from a mouth that seemed too wide, too full of teeth. And the eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed with an intelligence that was anything but animal, filled with a malevolent hunger that seemed to pierce right through me. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the breath driven from my lungs as I hit the forest floor. Pain exploded in my ankle, sprained, maybe broken. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my leg gave way beneath me. "Tyson!" Carter's voice cut through the panic clouding my mind. He appeared at my side, grabbing my arm and hauling me up. "Come on, man, we gotta move." I leaned on him heavily as we stumbled forward, each step sending jolts of agony up my leg. The creature's growls were getting closer, the sound of its pursuit growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, the trees ahead thinned, and we burst out onto the edge of a steep ravine. The others were already there, flashlight beams dancing across the sheer drop before us. "We're trapped," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. "What do we do?" Before anyone could answer, the creature exploded from the tree line behind us. In the combined light of our flashlights, we got our first clear look at the monstrosity that had been hunting us. It stood on two legs now, its hunched form easily 7 feet tall. Arms that were too long, too thin for its body, ended in hands tipped with wicked claws. Its chest heaved with each breath, a rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within its misshapen form. But it was the face that held us transfixed. In the harsh light, it looked almost melted, as if someone had taken a human visage and stretched it over a skull that was decidedly not human. The eyes, those terrible, knowing eyes, flicked between each of us in turn. And then it spoke. The sound was like gravel being ground together, a harsh approximation of human speech that made my skin crawl. "So long," it rasped, lips peeling back in a grotesque parody of a smile. "So long I've waited." Carter, still supporting me, took a stumbling step backward. "What? What are you?" The creature's head tilted to one side, an unsettlingly human gesture. "I am the Watcher," it said. "The Guardian. The punishment." It took a lumbering step forward, and we instinctively retreated, edging dangerously close to the ravine's drop. "Punishment for what?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking. The creature's grin widened, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "For trespass," it hissed, "for believing you could walk these ancient woods without consequence." My mind raced, grasping for anything that might get us out of this nightmare. "Wait!" I shouted, an idea forming. "We didn't know. We'll leave right now. Just let us go." The creature paused, its terrible gaze fixing on me. For a moment I dared to hope that somehow, impossibly, it might listen to reason. Then it laughed. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a cacophony of screeches and howls that seemed to come from a dozen throats at once. The trees around us shook, showering us with pine needles and bits of bark. "Leave?" it said when the terrible laughter subsided. "Oh no, little trespassers, you're part of the forest now." It lunged forward with frightening speed. Carter, still supporting me, lost his balance. We teetered on the edge of the ravine for one heart-stopping moment before plummeting into the darkness below. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past my ears, drowning out the sound of our screams. Branches whipped at my face and arms as we plunged through the canopy below. Then, with a bone-jarring impact, we hit the ground. Pain exploded through every inch of my body. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. When I finally managed to draw a ragged breath, I became aware of the warm stickiness of blood on my face. "Carter?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You okay, man?" There was no response. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, praying it had survived the fall. By some miracle, it flickered to life when I clicked the button. The beam illuminated a scene of devastation. We had landed in a tangle of undergrowth, surrounded by fallen branches and debris from our descent. Carter lay a few feet away, unmoving. I dragged myself over to him, ignoring the screaming protests of my battered body. "Carter," I said, shaking him gently. "Come on, buddy. Wake up." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dazed. "Ty," he mumbled. "What? Where are we?" Relief flooded through me. "We fell," I explained, helping him sit up. "The ravine, remember?" Memory dawned in his eyes, quickly followed by fear. "The others," he said. "Thomas and Mark. Where are they?" I swept the flashlight beam around us, searching for any sign of our friends. Nothing but twisted undergrowth and looming tree trunks. "I don't know," I admitted. "We got separated in the fall, I think." Carter struggled to his feet, wincing. "We have to find them," he said. That thing could still be up there." I nodded, using a nearby tree to pull myself upright. My ankle throbbed, but it held my weight. Small mercies. "Okay," I said. "But we need to be careful. We don't know what else might be down here." We set off slowly, calling out for Thomas and Mark in hushed voices. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs and dense ferns, making progress difficult. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, and more than once we froze at the sound of movement in the underbrush. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we heard a faint call. "Over here!" We hurried toward the sound, hope and fear warring in my chest. We rounded a massive redwood trunk to find Thomas kneeling beside a prone figure. Mark. "Oh, thank God," Thomas said when he saw us. I didn't know if anyone else made it." I knelt beside Mark, my heart sinking as I took in his condition. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His face was pale, beaded with sweat. "How bad is it?" Carter asked, his voice tight. Thomas shook his head. "Bad. He's in and out of consciousness. I don't think he can walk." I closed my eyes, trying to think. We were lost in an ancient forest, injured, with no supplies, and a monster lurking somewhere above us. The situation couldn't get much worse. Then, as if in answer to that thought, a familiar growl echoed through the trees. It was distant, but unmistakable. "It's coming," Mark whispered, his eyes wide with fear. We all fell silent, straining our ears. The growl came again, closer this time. And then another answered it, from a different direction. The blood drained from my face as the realization hit me. "There's more than one," I said, my voice barely audible. Carter's face was a mask of determination. "We need to move," he said. "Now." "But Mark," Thomas began. "We'll carry him," Carter interrupted. "Ty, can you walk?" I nodded, though my ankle protested at the thought. "I'll manage." Together, we lifted Mark as gently as we could, trying to ignore his muffled cries of pain. With Thomas and Carter supporting most of his weight, we began to move through the forest. Progress was agonizingly slow. The undergrowth seemed to grab at our feet, and every step was a struggle. The growls continued, sometimes fading into the distance only to return louder than before. It was as if the creatures were toying with us, herding us deeper into their domain. As we stumbled through a small clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, bringing my flashlight to bear, and felt my heart stop. There, at the edge of the light, stood another creature. Smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. Its eyes gleamed with the same unnatural intelligence, its mouth open in a silent snarl. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking, "we've got company." The others turned, and I heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath. The creature took a step forward, its movements liquid and predatory. "What do we do?" Carter whispered. I cast about desperately for a solution, any solution. My eyes fell on a fallen branch near my feet. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. I bent down slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature, and wrapped my fingers around the rough bark. "When I say run," I said, barely moving my lips, "you go. Don't look back, just go." "Ty, no," Thomas began, but I cut him off. "Just do it," I hissed. "Get Mark out of here. I'll catch up." The creature tensed, sensing the change in our stance. I tightened my grip on the branch, knowing it would do little against those claws, those teeth. But if I could buy the others even a few seconds... "Run!" I yelled, and lunged at the creature. Time seemed to slow as I charged toward the creature, branch raised like a club. Its eyes widened in what might have been surprise. Clearly, it hadn't expected its prey to fight back. In the split second before impact, a small, detached part of my mind marveled at how human that expression looked on its twisted face. Then we collided, and all rational thought fled. The creature was impossibly strong. My wild swing with the branch connected, but it might as well have been a toothpick for all the damage it did. Claws raked across my chest, tearing through my jacket and shirt like they were tissue paper. Pain bloomed, hot and sharp, but adrenaline kept me on my feet. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush behind me, their labored breathing and Mark's pained gasps fading into the distance. Good. At least I'd bought them some time. The creature lunged again, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and going down hard. The fall probably saved my life. The creature's charge carried it over me, giving me a moment to scramble away. I got to my feet, chest heaving, blood soaking my torn shirt. The creature circled me slowly, its movements almost lazy. It knew I was trapped, knew I had nowhere to run. Those terrible eyes never left mine, filled with a cruel intelligence that seemed to drink in my fear. "Why?" I gasped out, playing for time. "Why are you doing this?" The creature's head tilted, that unsettlingly human gesture again. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel grinding together. "You ask why, little trespasser. We are the guardians, the watchers. We keep the balance." I shook my head, uncomprehending. "Balance of what? We're just hikers. We didn't mean any harm." The creature's lipless mouth stretched in what might have been a smile. "Intention matters not. The old forest demands sacrifice. Blood for growth, death for life." It lunged again, faster than I could react. Claws raked across my arm, and I cried out in pain. I swung the branch wildly, more out of desperation than any real hope of doing damage. By some miracle, it connected with the creature's head, producing a satisfying crack. The creature reeled back, shaking its misshapen skull. A low growl rumbled from its chest, no longer toying but genuinely angry. I knew with cold certainty that my next few moments were likely to be my last. As the creature tensed for another attack, a shout rang out through the trees. "Hey, ugly! Over here!" Carter burst into the clearing, wielding a flaming branch like a torch. The firelight cast wild shadows, making the forest around us seem to writhe and move. The creature hissed, shrinking back from the flames. "Ty, come on!" Carter yelled, waving me toward him. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, ignoring the burning pain in my chest and arm. Carter waited until I was past him, then hurled the flaming branch at the creature. It screeched, a sound that set my teeth on edge, and retreated into the shadows. We ran. Through the underbrush, over fallen logs, ducking under low-hanging branches. Carter led the way, seemingly guided by some instinct I couldn't fathom. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the forest, its enraged howls echoing through the trees. "The others?" I gasped out between breaths. "Safe," Carter panted. "For now. Found a cave. Defensible." As if summoned by his words, the mouth of a cave loomed before us, a dark slash in a rocky hillside. Thomas stood at the entrance, another flaming branch in his hands. "Inside!" he yelled. "Quickly!" We dove into the cave just as an ear-splitting howl split the night air. Thomas thrust his makeshift torch toward the entrance, revealing our pursuer. The creature prowled at the edge of the firelight, its eyes reflecting the flames like twin infernos. "Back," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Back, you bastard." The creature snarled but didn't approach. It paced back and forth, clearly wary of the fire. After what felt like an eternity, it melted back into the forest with a final baleful glare. We sagged in relief, the adrenaline that had kept us going suddenly deserting us. The pain of my injuries came rushing back, and I hissed through clenched teeth. "Jesus, Ty," Carter said, getting a good look at me in the firelight. "You're a mess." "Yeah," I managed a weak grin. "You should see the other guy." Thomas helped me deeper into the cave, where Mark lay propped against the wall. His face was pale, pinched with pain, but his eyes were clear. "Thought you were a goner," he said as I slumped down beside him. I shook my head. "Can't get rid of me that easy." Carter knelt beside us, rummaging through the meager supplies we'd managed to grab in our flight from the campsite. He produced a first aid kit, battered but mercifully intact. Okay, he said, his voice all business. Let's get you patched up. As Carter cleaned and bandaged my wounds, Thomas kept watch at the cave entrance. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant howl that set our nerves on edge. So, Mark said eventually, anyone want to talk about what the hell those things are? We exchanged glances, each of us reluctant to voice the impossible things we'd seen and heard. It called itself a guardian, I said finally. Said something about keeping the balance, that the forest demands sacrifice. Thomas shook his head. That's insane. It's just an animal. A weird, scary animal, but... No, Carter interrupted, his voice firm. You heard it talk. You saw its eyes. That's no animal. A heavy silence fell over us. The implications of Carter's words hung in the air, too terrifying to fully contemplate. So what do we do? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do we fight something like that? I shook my head, wincing as the movement pulled at my freshly bandaged wounds. I don't think we can fight it. Not head on, at least. We need to find a way out of this forest. Thomas turned from his vigil at the cave entrance, his face grave in the flickering firelight. That's easier said than done. We're miles from any trail, with no supplies and 2 injured people. And those... things are out there hunting us. We can't just sit here and wait to die, Carter said, his voice tight with frustration. He paced the small confines of the cave, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something we can do. As if in response to his words, a low, rhythmic sound began to echo through the cave. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from deeper within the cave. Do you guys hear that? I asked, struggling to sit up straighter. The others fell silent, listening. The sound was clearer now, a steady, pulsing beat, like a giant heart throbbing in the earth. What the hell is that? Mark whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Thomas took a tentative step deeper into the cave, holding the torch out in front of him. The firelight revealed a narrow passage leading downward, disappearing into darkness. I think it's coming from down there, he said, his voice hushed with awe and fear. We exchanged glances, each of us wrestling with the same dilemma. The rational part of my mind screamed that we should stay put, that venturing deeper into an unknown cave system while being hunted by monsters was suicide. But another part of me, a part that seemed to resonate with that strange, pulsing rhythm, whispered that answers lay in the darkness below. We should check it out, I said, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. Are you insane? Mark hissed. We barely survived those things out there. Who knows what's down in that cave? Carter helped me to my feet, his face set with determination. Ty's right. Whatever's down there, it might be our only chance of understanding what's happening. And understanding might be our only chance of survival. Thomas hesitated, glancing back at the cave entrance. What if those creatures come back while we're down there? We'll leave a fire burning here, Carter said. If they're afraid of fire, it might keep them at bay, and we'll be able to find our way back. It wasn't a great plan, but it was the only one we had. With some effort, we managed to get Mark on his feet, Thomas and Carter supporting him between them. I picked up a branch from our makeshift fire, ignoring the pain that flared in my injured arm. Everyone ready? I asked, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I felt. With nods of grim determination, we began our descent into the heart of the cave. The passage was narrow and treacherous, forcing us to move in single file. The walls seemed to pulse in the flickering torchlight, in time with the strange heartbeat that grew louder with every step. As we ventured deeper, the air grew thick and humid, carrying a musty scent that reminded me of damp earth and decaying leaves. The rock beneath our feet gave way to soft soil, and roots began to protrude from the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. "Guys," Mark said, his voice tight with pain and fear. "I don't like this. Something feels wrong." I was about to agree when the passage suddenly opened up into a vast cavern. The sight that greeted us stole the breath from my lungs. In the center of the cavern stood an enormous tree, its trunk easily as wide as a house. But this was no ordinary tree. Its bark pulsed with an inner light, veins of luminescence spreading up into branches that disappeared into the darkness above. And at its base, pulsing in time with the light, was what could only be described as a heart, a massive organic structure that throbbed with unnatural life. "Oh my God," Carter breathed. "What is this place?" Before anyone could respond, a voice echoed through the cavern, the same gravelly, inhuman voice we'd heard in the forest above. "Welcome, trespassers," it said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome to the heart of the old forest." From the shadows emerged the creature that had been hunting us, but it was changed. Gone was the feral, predatory stance. It stood almost regally now, its misshapen form somehow noble in the pulsing light of the great tree. "You have proven yourselves worthy," it continued. "Few have the courage to seek understanding in the face of terror." What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature's lipless mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "We are the guardians, the watchers. We are the old forest made flesh." It gestured toward the pulsing heart of the tree. "This is the source, the wellspring of life that feeds these ancient woods. For millennia, we have protected it from those who would destroy, those who would take without giving in return." "But we didn't want to destroy anything," Thomas protested. "We were just hiking." The creature's eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, fixed on Thomas. "Intention matters not. The balance must be maintained. Blood for growth, death for life. It is the way of things." A chill ran down my spine as I began to understand. "You've been killing people," I said. "Sacrificing them to this." The creature nodded, a bizarrely human gesture on its inhuman form. "The old ways demand tribute, but you are different. You sought to understand even in your fear. That is rare." It took a step closer, its clawed hand outstretched. "You have a choice now. Join us. Become one with the old forest. Or leave and never return. But know this. The knowledge you carry is a burden. The outside world cannot know of this place." We exchanged glances, each of us grappling with the impossible decision before us. The pulsing light of the tree seemed to call to something deep within me, a primal part that longed to be one with the ancient power that thrummed through this place. But then I thought of home, of the lives we'd left behind, of all the people who would never know what happened to us if we stayed. "We can't stay," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "This isn't our world, but we won't reveal your secret. We'll make sure no one else comes here." The creature regarded us silently for a long moment, its ancient eyes seeming to peer into our very souls. Finally, it nodded. "So be it," it said. "You may leave. But remember, the old forest is always watching, always waiting. And should you ever return..." It left the threat unspoken, but we understood. With a final, long look at the pulsing heart of the forest, we turned and began the long journey back to the world we knew. The trek out of the forest was a blur of exhaustion and lingering fear. True to its word, the creature and its brethren left us unmolested. We emerged from the tree line as dawn broke, battered, bloodied, but alive. In the years that followed, we kept our promise. We never spoke of what we'd seen in the depths of the redwood forest. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes think I can hear that otherworldly heartbeat. And I know that somewhere out there, in the oldest, darkest parts of the world, ancient powers still lurk, watching and waiting. The suffocating embrace of Los Angeles had become too much to bear. The constant drone of traffic, the oppressive smog that hung over the city like a shroud, and the never-ending parade of people. It was all closing in on me. I, Ethan Blackwood, had always been drawn to the serenity of nature, and RV camping had become my escape from the mundane pressures of life. Growing up in the chaos of Los Angeles, I often found myself yearning for solitude and the simple pleasures of the great outdoors. That's how I ended up in the dense forests of Northern California, far away from the noise and pollution of the city. I had a knack for finding the most secluded spots where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. As I drove my battered but reliable old Winnebago along the winding forest roads, I felt a sense of anticipation building in my chest. The farther I got from civilization, the more at peace I felt. The towering redwoods and dense undergrowth seemed to welcome me, their ancient presence a stark contrast to the sterile concrete jungle I'd left behind. After hours of driving, I finally found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a crystal-clear stream. My RV looked out of place amid the ancient trees, a modern intruder in this timeless sanctuary. But it was my home for the next few days, and I was grateful for its shelter. I had packed enough supplies to last a week: canned goods, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty rifle for protection against any wild animals. Not that I expected to encounter anything dangerous, but you can never be too careful in the wilderness. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia, a city dweller's natural unease in the quiet of the forest. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual as I gathered firewood and set up my camping chair by the stream. The first day was uneventful, almost idyllic. I hiked along barely visible trails, marveling at the towering trees and the lush ferns that carpeted the forest floor. I tried my hand at fishing in the stream, more for the meditative quality of the act than any real hope of catching dinner. As the sun began to set, I returned to my campsite and built a fire. Sitting by the crackling flames, watching the sparks dance up into the darkening sky, I felt truly at peace for the first time in years. The worries and stresses of my life in Los Angeles seemed a world away. I thought about how lucky I was to have found this little slice of paradise. Little did I know, this paradise would soon turn into a nightmare. I woke early the next morning to the sound of rustling leaves. It wasn't the gentle breeze of the previous day. This was something different, more purposeful. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to catch any other sounds. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard whispers, barely audible and impossible to make out. Shaking off my unease, I attributed the sounds to wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the underbrush. I went about my morning routine, brewing coffee over the rekindled fire and enjoying a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal. As I sat reading a worn paperback thriller, I couldn't help but feel that the forest around me had changed overnight. The welcoming atmosphere of the previous day had been replaced by something more watchful. By mid-morning, I decided to go for a hike deeper into the woods. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a map, and my knife. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to leave the rifle behind, thinking it unnecessary for a short hike. The trail I chose was barely a trail at all, more of a game path winding through the forest. The further I went, the denser the vegetation became. Shafts of sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, creating an eerie twilight atmosphere even in the middle of the day. After about an hour of hiking, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A campsite, but not just any campsite. This one looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was an overturned tent, scattered belongings, and a half-burned fire. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. I cautiously approached, calling out to see if anyone was around. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest, but there was no response. As I examined the site more closely, I found personal items strewn about, clothes, a wallet, a backpack, but no sign of the people who had left them. Among the scattered belongings, I found a journal. Its pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes that made little sense, mentions of being watched, strange noises at night, and a final entry that simply read, "They're coming." A chill ran down my spine as I read those words, my imagination conjuring up all sorts of terrifying possibilities. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get back to my RV and drive as far away from here as possible. But curiosity, or perhaps some darker force, compelled me to look around a bit more. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but distinctly human. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the trees and the underbrush, silent as ever. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw him. A man stood a few yards away, partially obscured by the trees. He was gaunt and disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty as if he'd been living in the wilderness for weeks. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me, wild and unfocused, filled with a mix of fear and something else, something darker and more primal. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond, just stood there staring at me with those unsettling eyes. I took a hesitant step closer, and he bolted, disappearing into the forest with an agility that surprised me given his apparent condition. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. The sensible thing would be to head back to my campsite, to the relative safety of my RV. But what if this man needed help? What if he knew something about the abandoned campsite and the cryptic journal entries? Against my better judgment, I decided to follow him. I plunged into the underbrush, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. The man was fast, but I managed to keep him in sight, catching glimpses of his ragged form as he darted between the trees. We emerged into another clearing, and what I saw there made me wish I'd never left Los Angeles. It was the remnants of another campsite, but this one was even more chaotic than the first. Tents were shredded, camping gear was scattered everywhere, and most disturbingly, there were dark stains on the ground that looked horribly like blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear, and I could feel my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the man was gone, vanished into the trees like a ghost. I stood there, panting and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I came to, I found myself in a nightmarish situation. I was tied to a tree, my hands bound behind me with rough rope that bit into my skin. My head throbbed where I'd been struck, and my vision swam as I tried to focus on my surroundings. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was in some sort of makeshift camp. Crude shelters made of branches and animal hides surrounded me, and in the center was a fire pit, currently cold and empty. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, a sickly sweet odor I couldn't quite identify. Movement caught my eye, and I saw him, the man from the forest. He was crouched by one of the shelters, muttering to himself as he sorted through a pile of what looked like bones. As if sensing my gaze, he turned, and our eyes met. He approached slowly, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Up close, I could see that his eyes were sunken and bloodshot, his skin pale and covered in a network of scars and fresh cuts. He crouched down in front of me, his face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "This place isn't for you. The forest, It doesn't like outsiders. Who are you? I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. What happened to the other campers? He didn't answer, just stared at me with those wild eyes. Then he stood up and walked over to what I now realized was a makeshift altar. It was covered in strange symbols carved into wood and bone, and adorned with feathers, teeth, and other unidentifiable objects. He picked up a knife from the altar, its blade wickedly sharp and stained with what I prayed wasn't blood. As he approached me again, I struggled against my bonds, the rope cutting into my wrists. The forest demands sacrifice, he muttered, raising the knife. It's hungry. Always hungry. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the pain that was sure to come. But instead, I heard a loud crack, like a gunshot, and the man's body fell heavily to the ground beside me. I opened my eyes to see another man standing at the edge of the clearing, a rifle in his hands. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He approached cautiously, keeping his eyes on the man on the ground. He nudged him with his foot to make sure he was dead, then turned to me. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I think so," I replied, still in shock from the rapid turn of events. He quickly cut me loose and I stumbled to my feet, rubbing my raw wrists. "Thank you," I managed to say. "Who are you, and who was he?" The old man sighed heavily. "Name's Frank. I'm a park ranger. Been tracking this fella for weeks now. As for who he was, well, that's a long story. Let's get you back to your camp first. You look like you could use a strong drink and a sit-down." As we made our way back through the forest, Frank explained that there had been reports of missing campers in the area over the past few months. At first, they thought it was just careless hikers getting lost, but then they started finding abandoned campsites and signs of struggle. "We knew something was wrong," Frank said, "but we had no idea it was this bad. That fella back there, he wasn't always like that. Used to be a camper himself, name of Mike Holloway. Came out here about 6 months ago and never left." We reached my campsite as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I was relieved to see my RV still there, untouched. Frank helped me inside and I collapsed into a chair, my legs finally giving out as the adrenaline wore off. Frank rummaged through my supplies and found a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. He poured us each a generous measure and sat down across from me. "Now," he said, taking a long sip of his drink, "I reckon you've got some questions, and I've got a story to tell you. A story about this forest and the things that live in it. Things that most folks don't believe in. Things that don't show up in any guidebook or nature documentary." I leaned forward, my own drink forgotten in my hand. "What kind of things?" Frank's eyes grew distant, as if he was looking at something far beyond the walls of my RV. "Things as old as the trees themselves. Maybe older. They've been here long before we started coming into these woods, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Most of the time, they're content to leave us alone. But sometimes they get hungry." As the night deepened around us, Frank spun a tale that sounded more like something out of a horror novel than real life. He spoke of ancient spirits that dwelled in the oldest parts of the forest. Entities that had been worshipped by the native tribes long before European settlers arrived. "These spirits," Frank explained, "they're not good or evil in the way we think of it. They're like forces of nature, powerful, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to human concerns. But they do get restless sometimes. And when that happens, they start to influence the world around them." He went on to describe how, over the years, there had been cycles of strange occurrences in the forest. Periods where hikers would go missing more frequently, where rangers and locals would report odd sightings or inexplicable phenomena. "And sometimes," Frank said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "sometimes they find someone who's susceptible, someone they can use. I thought back to the wild-eyed man who had held me captive. You mean like Mike Holloway? Frank nodded grimly. Exactly like Mike. He came out here 6 months ago, just a regular guy looking to commune with nature. But something about him caught the attention of the forest spirits. Maybe he was more open to their influence, or maybe he just happened to camp in the wrong spot. Whatever the reason, they got into his head. The ranger described how Mike had gradually changed over the weeks he spent in the forest. At first, it was just small things. Talking to himself, building strange structures out of sticks and bones. But as time went on, he became more erratic, more violent. We tried to help him, Frank said, a note of regret in his voice. Tried to convince him to leave the forest to get some help. But by then, it was too late. He was convinced that the forest was speaking to him, that it needed sacrifices to stay strong. I shuddered, remembering Mike's words about the forest being hungry. So all those missing campers? Frank nodded solemnly. Some of them probably just got lost. But others, well, you saw those campsites. And there were others we found that were even worse. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of Frank's words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since he first appeared. Why are you telling me all this? Isn't there some kind of cover-up? I can't imagine the Parks Department wants this kind of story getting out. Frank chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Son, I've been working these woods for over 40 years. I've seen things that would turn your hair white. And I've learned that sometimes the truth is the only thing that can keep people safe. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the danger. You need to respect this forest and the things that live in it. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. And most importantly, you need to leave. First thing in the morning, you pack up and you drive out of here. Don't stop, don't look back. Just go. I nodded, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the RV. What about you, and what happened today? I'll take care of it, Frank said, standing up. I've got protocols for this kind of situation. As far as anyone else will know, Mike Holloway was a disturbed individual who tragically died while camping. A cautionary tale about the dangers of going into the wilderness unprepared. He moved to the door of the RV, pausing with his hand on the handle. Remember what I said. Leave at first light. And if you ever feel the urge to come back to these woods, fight it. For your own sake. With that, he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the forest. I barely slept that night, every creak and rustle outside the RV setting my nerves on edge. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was already up and packing. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just days ago now felt oppressive, its shadows hiding untold horrors. I moved quickly, breaking down my campsite and stowing everything in the RV. Every so often I would pause, certain I'd heard a whisper on the wind or caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But each time I turned to look, there was nothing there but trees and underbrush. As I was doing a final check of the area, making sure I hadn't left anything behind, I noticed something strange. At the base of a large tree near where I'd parked the RV, there was a small pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. I was certain it hadn't been there the day before. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. The stones were arranged in a spiral with a larger, flat stone in the center. Carved into this central stone was a crude symbol, a tree with what looked like faces peering out from its branches. For a moment, I considered taking the stone as evidence of my experience. But Frank's warnings echoed in my mind, and I decided it was best to leave it undisturbed. Whatever message it was meant to convey, I didn't want to know. With a final glance at the forest that had been my home for the past few days, I climbed into the RV and started the engine. As I pulled away from the clearing, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing among the trees, tall and inhuman, its body seeming to shift and blend with the forest around it. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove faster than was probably safe on the winding forest roads, not slowing until I reached the main highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest finally lifting. The drive back to Los Angeles was long and uneventful, giving me plenty of time to think about what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a bad dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But the rope burns on my wrists and the lump on the back of my head were very real reminders that what I'd experienced was no dream. For weeks after my return, I was jumpy and paranoid. Every unexpected sound made me flinch, and I found myself avoiding parks and even well-manicured lawns. The concrete jungle of LA, which I had been so eager to escape, now felt comfortingly solid and real. I debated whether to tell anyone about what had happened. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. Who would believe me anyway? A tale of ancient forest spirits and murderous hermits sounded insane even to my own ears. I did, however, keep an eye on the news, searching for any reports of missing hikers or strange occurrences in the area where I had camped. There were a few stories, a lost hiker here, an abandoned campsite there, but nothing that hinted at the true horrors lurking in those woods. About a month after my return, I received a package. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a small town near the forest where I had camped. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a small, smooth stone, similar to the ones I had seen arranged in that strange pattern. Carved into its surface was the same symbol, the tree with faces in its branches. Wrapped around the stone was a note, written in a shaky hand. Remember, respect, never return. I recognized Frank's handwriting from the maps he had shown me. The message was clear. This was both a warning and a reminder. The forest and its spirits were real, and they were not to be trifled with. Years have passed since that fateful camping trip, and I've done my best to put it behind me. I moved away from Los Angeles, seeking a fresh start in a bustling East Coast city where the tallest things around me are skyscrapers, not ancient trees. I've never gone camping again. The call of the wild that once drew me so strongly now fills me with dread. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the city trees, I find myself thinking about that forest. I wonder about Frank, the grizzled old ranger who saved my life. Is he still out there, protecting unsuspecting campers from horrors they can't imagine? Or has he too fallen victim to the hungry spirits of the woods? And I think about Mike Holloway, the man who had been so thoroughly claimed by the forest. Was he truly gone? Or was some part of him still out there, wandering the shadowy paths between the trees? Most of all, I think about the spirits themselves. Are they confined to that one forest? Or are they everywhere, watching and waiting from every patch of wilderness? The thought keeps me awake some nights, staring out my window at the city lights and imagining what might be hiding in the darkness beyond. I keep the carved stone Frank sent me on my desk as a constant reminder, not just of the danger I survived, but of the thin veil that separates our mundane world from forces we can barely comprehend. It serves as a warning to respect the wild places of the world and to never underestimate the power of nature, both seen and unseen. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I could swear I hear whispers, faint and just on the edge of comprehension. In those moments, I'm transported back to that forest, surrounded by ancient trees and watched by hungry spirits. And I wonder, did I ever truly escape? Or did a part of me remain there, forever wandering those dark and secret paths? As I sit here, writing down this account of my experience, I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. Not by anything in this city, but by something far away, patient and ancient. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that somewhere in a distant forest, the spirits are stirring once again, awaiting their next unsuspecting visitor. Remember, respect, never return. These words have become my mantra, a shield against the lingering whispers of the forest. But even as I repeat them, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, the forest will call me back. And when it does, will I have the strength to resist? Months after I finished writing my account, I received another package. This one was larger, heavier. Inside, I found a collection of journals, their pages yellowed with age and warped by moisture. A note tucked inside the cover read simply, "Found these in an old ranger station. Thought you should have them. F." As I read through the journals, a chill settled over me. They contained accounts dating back decades, all telling similar stories to mine. Campers, hikers, and rangers who had encountered something inexplicable in the forest. Some had escaped, like me. Others hadn't been so lucky. The final entry in the last journal caught my eye. It was dated just a few weeks ago, written in a hand I recognized. Frank's. "I'm getting too old for this," he had written. "Been fighting these woods for too long. It's someone else's turn now. Leaving these journals for the next poor soul who needs to know the truth. God help them." The entry ended there. I tried to contact Frank to find out what had happened to him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The ranger station where he had worked had no record of him. It was as if he had never existed. As I sit here now, surrounded by these journals full of forgotten horrors, I realize that I'm part of something larger than myself. A cycle of discovery, terror, and warning that has been repeating for generations. I don't know what compelled Frank to send me these journals, or what has become of him. But I do know this. The story of the forest and its spirits isn't over. It will never be over. There will always be those who are drawn to the wilderness, seeking escape or enlightenment, and there will always be something waiting for them, hungry and patient. So I'll do what Frank did. I'll keep these journals safe, adding my own account to their pages. And if someday someone comes to me with wild eyes and a tale of terror from the woods, I'll pass this knowledge on. Because in the end, that's all we can do. Warn those who will listen, and hope that it's enough to keep the hungry spirits at bay. But even as I write these final words, I can hear it. A faint whisper, like wind through distant trees. And I wonder, not for the first time, if the forest has truly let me go, or if it's just biding its time, waiting for the day when I can no longer resist its call. Remember, respect, never return. The mantra echoes in my mind, a desperate prayer against the encroaching whispers. But will it be enough? Only time will tell.